From a very early age, I remember being acutely aware that my dad had a lot of money. Even when we were still living in a small 2-up, 2-down terraced house in Garston, and I had just started school, I remember feeling this deep source of pride that my dad had the best car in the street. It was the late 70s back then, and the area of Liverpool we lived in was a rough one. There was a lot of crime, a lot of unemployment, and both my parents grew up in conditions so squalid that I had to see them to believe them. But I think that's what made my dad into the man he was. Growing up, his parents didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, so by the time he was a young man, that's all he thought about. Money, money, money. I heard that he was a clever lad growing up. He did well in school and earned great results in his exams, but when it came time to pick a trade and learn a skill, Dad announced that he wanted to go to university instead. To him, getting a business or accountancy degree was the golden ticket to a lifetime of potential good earnings. But after traveling down to London for his School of Economics interview, he came back with a completely different plan. In the late 70s, when Dad started his business, Russia was known as the USSR, and it operated behind what was called the Iron Curtain. And basically this meant that there were strict export controls and massive bureaucratic hurdles on both sides if you wanted to trade with them. The process was even more tiresome if you wanted to import old Russian antiques. But since London was, and still is, home to a very large and very wealthy community of Russian expats, you could make millions selling them artifacts from a homeland they'd never returned to. And so, that's what my dad started doing. Apparently he'd gotten the idea from some old geezer in a London pub, one who'd listened to his story and decided to give him a tip. And at first glance, importing just about anything of value from the old Soviet Union was impossible. But if you had a man on the inside, someone in Russia who could grease the wheels of commerce, as they say, then suddenly piles of paperwork and months of waiting became a handshake and some cash in an envelope. And it was this man on the inside the old geezer was offering to my dad. A few weeks later, Dad's on a boat headed for Murmansk, a big Russian port city near the border with Norway. And it's there that he meets his contact, and it's there that he started his business in earnest, with the purchase of his first ever antique religious icon. It sold for a whopping £3,000, which is about $12,000 in today's money, and then factor in that he bought the icon from his contact for just a few £100, and you start to understand why he made so much money. We moved out of Garston and out to a big fancy house in Halewood when I was still in primary school. That was another source of pride for me and my little brother, and it wasn't too far from our school or friends, so there were no complaints from either of us. But the same could not be said in 1989 when I was 14 years old, and Dad announced that we were moving again. Because that time, we weren't moving to a nice big house down the road. He was moving us up to a tiny rural hamlet named Waterside on the east coast of Scotland, or basically, the middle of effing nowhere. When he first told me, I thought he was taking the piss. His business was in Liverpool, our schools were in Liverpool, and all of our friends were in Liverpool. Everything we knew and loved was there, at home. So what the bloody hell would he want to move up to rural Scotland for? I remember him sitting us down at the kitchen table, my mom, myself, and my little brother, and explaining that he'd finally earned enough money to do what he'd always wanted to do. Move up to Aberdeenshire, the land of his fathers, and live a quiet, simple life as a gentleman farmer. And what followed was like a variation of the 5 stages of grief. After initially refusing to believe it, we were furious and asked Dad things like, "How could you do this to us?" I had my first boyfriend, my little brother had his beloved scout troop, and my mom thought living up in the arse end of nowhere sounded boring beyond belief. We'd put down roots and we didn't want to be uprooted. So then came the bargaining phase as we asked if we could stay in Liverpool while he moved up to Scotland. And he said no, of course, that he was selling the house to finance the purchase of the other, and that prompted us to enter the depression phase, and then finally, acceptance. Just over a week later, Dad loaded everything into a moving truck, and then we got into the car with Mum and drove behind him all the way to Aberdeenshire. Looking back on it, the scenery once we crossed over into Scotland was incredible. But considering the mood that we were in, we couldn't appreciate it. Waterside was gorgeous too, a collection of large houses nestled on the bank of a river, but it didn't feel like home, and it wouldn't for some time. A mile down the road from Waterside was a little seaside town called Newborough. It's a beautiful little place, but back then, it felt like we'd step back in time by about 50 years. Aside from the church, the greengrocers, and a little coffee shop, it was just houses, ponds, and fields. There were no playgrounds, no arcades, and worst of all, no cinema. Dad took us to the grocer's and coffee shop that first day, then tried to bribe us with cake as he gave us a little pep talk. And the way he saw it, I'd only have to live there for 4 years. In a nice quiet place like that with none of the distractions of the big city, and I could focus on getting the best exam results possible. That way, when I got into my first choice of uni, I could drink, smoke, and go clubbing as much as I liked, and he wouldn't be there to stop me. And I'll admit, the prospect gave me a bit of hope. I could keep in touch with my mates on the phone, visit them whenever we drove back to Liverpool to see my gran, and then in 4 years, I could ace my way into Liverpool Uni and be back home where I belonged. My little brother adjusted quite quickly too, especially once he found out Newborough had a scout troop of its own. And then over the next month or so, we all slowly adjusted to our new lives up there in the Scottish countryside. I started school not long after moving, and despite my abject terror that I'd be some freakish English loner, I made friends with a couple of Scottish girls quite quickly. We'd go walking on the beaches together, which was another thing about Newborough and Waterside that really won me over. Then we'd walk back into town to grab coffee together at the place with the really good cake. And then one day, as I was enjoying my tea and cake, my friend Nicola leaned over with her eyes on the table and whispered, "That man is looking at you." And I felt my heart rate pick up a bit when she said it, and then she added, "Behind you. He keeps looking over here at us, but mostly at you." She leaned back, then casually continued with whatever she was saying prior, but I couldn't match her calmness. I turned in my seat, pretending to look at the menu board behind the counter, and there he was in my peripheral vision. I half caught him looking when I turned too. Nicola was right. I turned back, then quietly asked Nicola if she recognized him, and she said no. She knew everyone in Newborough and knew a new face when she saw one. There was a stranger in town, and he'd taken an interest in me. As you can imagine, I was not flattered. I was 14, and this guy looked to be in his 20s or 30s, way too old for a girl my age, so the first thing that came to my mind was perv. But then if he didn't live in town and he didn't live up in Waterside, then he was a perv that I wouldn't have to worry about once I'd finished my cake. And the thought calmed me down for a bit, though it was still not very pleasant having to eat knowing his eyes were stuck to me. And once we'd finished, we'd thanked the owner and walked out of the coffee shop, only to realize that the man was following us. Nicola swore that it was her sixth sense kicking in, but as we were walking down the lane, she looked over her shoulder, then turned back and said, "He's following us." My instinct was honestly to run, not to confront the guy, but Nicola turned around and started asking him, bold as brass, "Are you following us, you perv?" He was tall, with dark hair and a dark jacket, and he had sunglasses on even though it was pretty overcast that day. For a second, a part of me thought that he was going to reply with, "I'm just walking to my car, love," or something like that, in which case, we'd made a total scene over nothing. But instead, the man just kept on silently walking towards us. Nicola and I got very nervous as he got close, but then he just sort of passed us. He didn't look at us, he didn't talk to us, he just walked right past us and carried on down that lane. Nicola and I were just stood there for a second like, what was all that about? We had zero clue why he hadn't just reacted to a 14-year-old girl calling him a perv. But what we were certain of is that we weren't about to walk the same way as him, even if our houses were in that same direction. Instead, Nicola and I walked back into town and sat in the coffee shop for about half an hour before attempting our walk home for a second time. We walked together for a while, talking about this and that until we parted ways, and I was then faced with crossing the bridge over the river alone. But right as I was about to cross the river, I spotted someone in the car park just off the left of the bridge. It was the man from the coffee shop, the one with the sunglasses, and it looked an awful lot like he was watching me. When I got home, I told my mom about him and how creepy it felt knowing that I was getting stared at. She said the man was just a tourist by the sounds of things, as they often drive up the East Coast, stopping here and there on the way. She also said that, unfortunately, unwanted gazes were something everyone had to deal with from time to time. Men stare at women when they're being lecherous, she said, and they also stare at each other when they're trying to start trouble down in the pub on a Saturday night. In both cases, the solution were the same. Avoid the stare at all costs and leave if you feel unsafe in any way. Mom laughed when I told her about Nicola calling the guy a pervert and said that she liked the sound of her. And then I took a lot of reassurance in the fact that I was never going to see that guy again. But then, just a few days later, I did see him again, and he basically did the exact same thing. I'd walked into town on my own, then went into a minor panic when I saw him standing in a shop doorway wearing those same sunglasses and that same black jacket. I prayed that he wouldn't follow me again, but he did, and I did the same thing of doubling back and trying to lose him or wait him out. I really didn't want him following me out of town, and Nicola was away visiting her granny that weekend, so I couldn't call her for backup. Instead, I ended up calling a minicab to drive me all the way home. And then luckily, by the time it arrived outside the coffee shop, the man in the sunglasses seemed to have gotten bored and had stopped following me around. I was a bit relieved and a bit annoyed because if I had known that he was going to get bored, I'd have saved a few quid and not rang a cab. But I had a little chat with the driver on the journey and then hopped out once we crossed the bridge and I was near my house. I just collected my change and I was climbing into the back seat when I saw a car behind us. It stopped less than 50 meters back, close but not too close, and I could have sworn that I'd seen it somewhere before. Well, I had, and as the cab took off, the car followed it. It was the same car that I'd seen parked near the bridge not a few days before, and in the driver's seat was the man in the sunglasses. And for as long as I live, I'll never forget how sick I felt walking up the pathway to my house. It wasn't so much that the guy had managed to follow me home, although that indeed was bad. It was the fact that as he drove past me after I climbed out of the cab, he had this big, smarmy grin spread across his face. It was like this sick sort of victory smile, that I win, and now I know where you live look. After walking through the door, I went straight to my mom and told her what had happened. I remember how her face dropped when I mentioned the car because, like me, she realized how serious the situation had become. This wasn't just some pervy older man following a schoolgirl around the village. This guy was tracking me, following me, stalking me. Most of the time, my dad was either out playing golf or drinking down at the village pub, but on that day, he was home, so when he heard me crying to my mom, he came running. He asked what was the matter, and when I told him, I assumed he'd just be angry. I thought he'd be straight onto the phone with the police, furiously demanding they do something before he does it himself, but he didn't do that. In fact, he didn't seem even remotely irritated. Instead, and for the first time in my whole life, I saw what my dad looked like when he was scared. I first noticed it when he was asking me to describe what the fella who followed me looked like. He asked about the car, if he talked like us, and what his voice sounded like, all sorts of questions like that. But aside from his physical description, I knew nothing about him. Once I'd finished saying everything I had to say, I thought Dad would dial 999, but he didn't. He just sat there with this wide-eyed, frightened look on his face like he was trying to figure out what to do. I remember saying something like, "Dad, aren't you going to phone the police?" Then my mom joined in asking what was going on and why he was acting like that. I suppose Mom knew him long enough to be able to read what was on his face because she started asking him to talk to her and tell her what was going on in this accusatory tone of voice. Dad stayed quiet for a bit, head in his hands by then, and the more scared he got, the more scared I got. Mom started raising her voice and shouting at him, then he shouted back at her to stay quiet, and then told me to go up to my room and make sure my brother stayed upstairs too. Keeping him up there was no problem. Dad had bought him a computer and a TV for his room, so he was glued to it, playing Mario or whatever and blissfully ignorant what was going on downstairs. Me, on the other hand, I couldn't stay put, and just a minute or so later, I slipped out of my room and stood at the top of the stairs and tried to listen in on what Mom and Dad were saying. They had the door closed downstairs, so I couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but I knew it was bad. They were trying not to raise their voices, but they were barely managing it, and although I heard them argue like that before, it was nothing like what I heard that day. Dad sounded terrified, so much so that I barely recognized his voice. Mom, on the other hand, sounded absolutely furious because she finally burst into tears. Ugly sobs, too, like she'd completely lost control. Dad cried as well, and they cried together for a minute before their voices went low again and I lost them completely. When I heard the door open downstairs, I snuck back into my bedroom. I didn't want Mom and Dad thinking that I'd been listening in on their conversation, even though I had. I stayed in my room for a bit, wondering what was so terrible that they'd cried over it. And then after a while, I heard footsteps coming from the stairs and Mom walked into my bedroom. She told me to pack my suitcase because we were leaving that night. She also warned me not to forget anything because we wouldn't ever be going back to that house in Waterside. Not ever. Mom then went into my brother's room and told me the exact same thing. Maybe an hour later, we were on the road, our suitcases and bags piled in the boot with some strapped to the top of Dad's Range Rover. We were driving down a narrow country lane, lined on each side by dry stone walls, and I was sitting in the back seat with my little brother. Mom and Dad were up front, not talking to each other, and there was this really tense atmosphere in the car. The tears had barely dried on Mom and Dad's faces, and my brother was furious that we were moving again, and I simply sat there just sort of shell-shocked. A few hours before, I'd popped into town to buy some stationery, then there I was, relocating for the second time in months, and somehow it was all my fault. I remember how quiet it was at first as we drove through the night, but then suddenly, I heard the sound of a loud engine revving behind us. I turned and saw a car speeding towards us up the lane with its headlights glaring. I remember shouting "Dad" to turn his attention towards it, but his eyes were already in the rear view. He gripped the steering wheel, put his foot down on the accelerator, and then the car lurched forward as he did. He was trying to outrun it, but the other car was too fast. And the next thing I remember, it was ramming into our back bumper so hard it made the car shake. My little brother started screaming and Mom shouted something, but all I remember is leaning over in the back seat and hugging my little brother. I just didn't know what else to do. A second or two later, the dark car behind us was speeding up alongside us, and a fella I didn't recognize was leaning out the passenger window shouting something like, "Stop the car, I'm warning you, stop the car." My dad didn't even look at him. He just kept his eyes on the road, still trying to outrun them. But whatever 4x4 they were driving was much faster than Dad's. The stranger in the passenger seat leaned back into the other car, and then suddenly, he swerved beside us, trying to push us off the lane. Dad sped up, but the road twisted and our tires screeched as he struggled to keep us on the tarmac. Once we rounded the curve, the car bashed into us again, harder this time. Our car shook and Dad kept it in control, but the other car stayed close, its engine roaring as it kept trying to push us off the road. I didn't think we stood a chance, and that at any second, we were about to be pushed into a ditch or a tree and the car would flip, roll, and burn with all of us inside of it. Every single second felt like our last, and all I could do was hug my brother as he screamed. I remember closing my eyes as I lied through my teeth and told him we'd be fine, we'd be fine. Then, when I opened them again, I saw a rooftop through our car's window. A rooftop meant a building, and a building like that one meant we were near a village. Dad put his foot down, weaving through the lane's bends, and then as we got closer and closer to the village, the dark car hesitated, then started to fall back. Lights from houses appeared, and I saw a few people walking near the road. The car behind us slowed, its headlights dimming in the distance, and then it turned off onto a side path and vanished. We didn't stop. Dad just slowed down a bit as we reached the village's Market Street, and then we passed through and kept on going, driving all the way down the east coast until we got to Edinburgh. We checked into a hotel, with Mom and Dad in one room and me and my brother in another next to theirs, and then Mom and Dad continued to argue until we fell asleep. I was only 14, so I was still too young for Mom and Dad to fully explain what was going on, but I knew that there was something they weren't telling me, and I knew it was something big. And I didn't find out what that thing was until many years later when Dad ran off with another woman, to Bulgaria of all places, and Mom spilled the beans. Dad hadn't been importing antiques from Russia, or rather, not any real antiques anyways. They were all fakes, all mock-ups commissioned by Russian heroin traffickers, and they were all stuffed with plastic-wrapped packages of the substance. That was how Dad made his money. Actually made his money, I mean. He wasn't an antiques dealer, selling specialist pieces to wealthy Russian expats. He was a heroin trafficker, flooding the streets of Britain with dangerous, dirt-cheap drugs. It was all going really well for a while. He was making millions, but poured loads of it back into the community around him, which is why he was such a popular fella when we were growing up. He did that out of necessity, though, Not the kindness of his heart, because he knew that flashing cash without greasing palms would have some old busybody snitching on him in no time. We moved out of Garston, spent a few years in that nice big house in Halewood, and all the while, Dad's still raking in millions. He's not working alone, though. He's working with a network of distributors all over the country, and he's making everyone a lot of money in the process. But then one day, after his pile of money had gotten big enough, or he couldn't stomach the risk anymore, he decided he wanted to retire. He talked to his parents, laid out his reasons, and even offered to train up a replacement. But they weren't too excited with the idea of him just walking away. He was making everyone too much money for that, so instead they gave him a counteroffer. Carry on shipping in smack from Soviet Russia and keep everyone's pockets filled, or he and his family would be filling up holes on some isolated piece of farmland somewhere. Dad pretended he got the message and carried on business as usual for a while, and then one day, he just disappeared. The reason he didn't tell any of us about the move to Scotland was because he couldn't risk anyone finding out he was leaving. Then when he disappeared, every one of his former partners up and down the country sent people out looking for him. Professionals too, which was how one found us so fast. Mom had no idea how Dad really made his money, so when he finally told her, she immediately asked for a divorce. And the way she saw it, his line of work had put us in danger since the day he started, and she couldn't reconcile the fact that he'd forced her and the kids to live in that kind of ignorance. We then started the process of moving abroad, and Dad came with us for a little while, but like I said, he ended up doing a second vanishing act. Last we heard, he was living in Sofia with a woman half his age, making the most of the exchange rate on what little money he had left. And I don't hate him, not like my brother does. I just see him as a deeply flawed human being who thought that he was smart enough to game the system. He taught me a lot in life, but that lesson is the primary one. The people who think they're smart enough to do so are actually the ones too stupid or arrogant to realize they can't. Because you can never game the system. The system only ever games you. I was 22 years old when this happened. I worked in a grocery store which had been featured in the news, and you could see me in the clip, and it was clear where I worked. I just came back from vacation, and a coworker told me that some guy had been coming around every day for a week asking for me. When I asked who or why they told me, they had no idea, but he was around my age and seemed a little off. A few hours passed by, and my coworker came and told me that the guy was back and again asking for me. We'll just call this guy James. I can't even remember his name anyways. In the back room, we had a computer and you could see all the camera footage from all over the store. I looked and didn't recognize who James was, but decided to go ask what he wanted. And he was clearly drunk and said that he had seen me on TV and wanted to ask me out. I replied, "I'm sorry, but I'm in a relationship," even though I was single. I said that I needed to get back to work, and he asked me if he should come with me. I was confused and said that I am working, and he then left, but I could see him through the cameras outside the store drinking. A few hours had passed, and he was waiting for me outside, so I had to use another exit when I left. The next day I came to work and saw him waiting for me outside the store. He had this huge smile on his face and walked up to me. He was really shy and didn't say a word until I said hey while passing by to get into the store, and he followed me inside and said that he needed to talk. I asked him what's up, and he replies, "How about we go to the movies?" At this point, I could tell that he was really creepy, and I replied, "I'm sorry, I have a boyfriend, remember?" As I was walking away, he started following me again and asked if he should come to help me with my work. "No thanks," I replied, once again, and I looked at the camera footage, and yet again he was waiting for me outside. And at this point, I started asking my male coworker to escort me safely to the tram every night when my shift ended. I started getting really scared once this had been going on for a while, and he clearly wouldn't leave me alone. I asked my brother if he could drive me to work on his motorcycle and hug me outside my workplace so it looked like he was my boyfriend and James would maybe finally leave me alone. Since I knew he was somewhere watching and waiting for me to get to work, but that didn't seem to help. I started getting messages like, "Is that your boyfriend?" and "He doesn't need to know if we go out." And I was confused about how he had gotten my number. I asked all of my coworkers, and a new one said that she'd given my number because he said he was a friend of mine. And I was pissed. At this point, I asked my male coworker to throw him out if he ever came back, which was a lot to ask. And a couple of weeks went by without any harassment, and I finally thought that he had left me alone. But boy, was I wrong. I came to work one day and was in the changing room and heard that we have a new coworker and it was his first day. I didn't think anything of it and proceeded to change my clothes. Once I got out of the changing room, my jaw dropped. Another coworker said, "Hey, this is James." And I looked in horror as she asked me what was wrong. I said, "I know. This is the creep that had been stalking me for weeks." As James started to smile. I went and searched for my boss to ask him what in God's name happened. My boss said that he had no idea that this was my stalker and kind of just laughed it off as no big deal. And I told him, either he leaves or I will. And he said that I wouldn't have to work the same shift as James and that he couldn't fire him right there. But he lied. I had a lot of shifts with him, and whenever I went, he would just follow me without saying a single word, and he would just continue to follow me. I would often have my lunch break by the computer so I could see where he was. And every day I could see him just staring at me, behind me as I ate, as we had a lot of cameras there also. And this went on for a while. He would text me every day, but at work he didn't say a thing, just sit there and stare. Now my boss finally understood what a freak James was and that he really didn't do any work either, just kind of stalking me, and started to think of ideas of how to get rid of him. And one time I noticed James was clearly drunk at work and I finally told my boss. And thankfully that day, he got fired. And this is when the stalking finally stopped. Some conversations in hell feel less like discussions and more like dissections. Cold, clean, bloodless. No fire, no fury, just silent blades carving open the future. This one began with Asmodeus. He was no creature of deference. He didn't kneel, didn't beg. But when he came to Lucifer, it wasn't with pride. It was with hierarchy and necessity. Something had gone wrong. A deviation, a fracture in the clockwork of sulfur. Victoria, a strange daughter of the elder succubus, Mrs. Robinson, was pregnant, and the child wasn't normal. Not human, not angelic, not even something hell had a word for. A hybrid, half incubus, half vampire. It wasn't the mix of bloodlines that disturbed Asmodeus. It was the absence of predictability. The child wasn't bound to anything. No prophecy, no allegiance, just raw, unshaped potential. Left alone, it could become anything. A king, a weapon, and worst of all, a rival. Asmodeus had already decided to invest everything into Talia's unborn son, a pure-born incubus carefully bred to rule. There could be no contests, no second line, only one heir. So he proposed a solution. Not death. It was too messy, too loud. The hybrid would be taken at birth and erased, given to the humans who operated in silence, off the books, beneath the maps, behind layers of redacted history, black sites, places where screams were data and souls were test subjects. Lucifer didn't object, not because it protected Hell's order or Asmodeus' station, because it offered something better, opportunity. He didn't see a threat. He saw an empty vessel. No ties to heaven, no loyalty to hell. A blank page, and in its hunger for meaning, for power, for love, he would write a new story. He would give it a name, a cause, a target. Not today, not tomorrow. But one day the child would outgrow its chains, and when it did, Lucifer would be waiting, arms open, smile sharp. He didn't fear chaos. He cultivated it. And so, without parchment, without trumpet, without witness, the plan moved forward. Hell held its breath. Asmodeus departed in silence, and Lucifer remained, already imagining the sound the cage would make when it opened, not to punish the child, but to watch what it would become. The summons came days later. Mrs. Robinson and her daughter Talia answered without hesitation. No one declines a call from Lucifer, especially not during sacred times, and this was sacred. Talia stood at the threshold of delivering a true-born incubus, the first since her own father. Before his untimely death, he had been sculpted for succession, molded by centuries of Asmodeus's ambition. Even in hell, succession matters. Retirement may not come with peace or gold watches, but it comes. Eventually, even the oldest devils step aside. Talia's chambers were already draped in blood-red silk, the circle of lust thrumming with anticipation. A celebration loomed, one to rival coronations. This meeting was private. No court, no entourage, just four. Lucifer, Asmodeus, Mrs. Robinson, and Talia. Lucifer didn't bother with ceremony. He gave the plan plainly, like a blade handed hilt first. Victoria's child, the hybrid, would be taken at birth. No trace, no memory. Clean, surgical, final. Mrs. Robinson raised a brow. Talia, by contrast, wore her stone expression like a veil, though her mother noticed the flicker of hesitation behind her eyes. "I may be estranged from my daughter, my lord," Mrs. Robinson said, dipping into a shallow bow. "But if you expect me to steal my own grandchild..." Lucifer didn't speak. He didn't need to. The task had already been assigned. To humans. Operatives buried within governments, beneath history. They were watching, waiting, ready. It would be as though the child had never existed. Mrs. Robinson understood. The time for protest had passed. What remained was the price for silence, the reward for obedience. "And for my silence?" she asked. Lucifer smiled. The offer came soft, like sin whispered through silk. "Queen of the Succubi." Not a puppet title, but the crown Lilith abandoned. Recognition, power, legacy, all hers for the price of a child she would never hold. "My lord is generous," she murmured, hunger tucked beneath a polished tongue. Talia stepped forward, unwilling to be eclipsed. She demanded her share. Lucifer obliged. He would name her High Matron of Lust, the destined consort to the future incubus king. Her son would be raised in hell, trained by Asmodeus himself, sculpted into a ruler. Victoria's child would only ever be an obstruction, and now it was being cleared away. Talia didn't hesitate. Her future had been unsure, but now with the path clear, she could walk it unchallenged. No contracts, no blood seals. In hell, a demon's word is enough. The deal was done. And elsewhere, far from the quiet treachery, Victoria imagined painting a nursery. She dreamed of folded baby clothes, smiled at the thought of her husband holding their child, fantasized of something tender, a life, a home, a family she thought that she could finally have. It was all she ever wanted. She believed her mother might soften, that Talia might be there when the time came, that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. But the ending had already been written, and when her child came, when its first breath split the air, it would not be greeted with joy. Only screams, ones of fear, survival, and desperation. A betrayal dressed in maternal robes. Because in hell, love is never love. It is currency. And betrayal, that's just part of the exchange. My name is Kathy. I'm from New England, and I have a story from my childhood which you and your viewers might be interested in. Back when I was just 12 years old, so almost 50 years ago now, my God. My family and I moved from Providence, Rhode Island to a little town called East Corinth up in Maine. My dad had been running his construction company since before I was born. And then after it took off, he started to make some real cash and he bought us a beautiful 3-story home on Main Street. He said he did it so me and my little brother could be raised someplace with small town values, quote unquote. But to us, it was like stepping into another world. We went from big city Providence to a one-stoplight town where the biggest attraction was the Corinth Historical Society. And needless to say, my brother and I were not happy at first, and Mom wasn't too pleased about it either. But after just the first few days in Corinth, we started to take a real shine to the place, so to speak. The food at the local diner was fantastic. There were basketball courts near our house, and the peace and quiet you got at night out there was amazing. Everyone in town was really welcoming too. The local pastor came over the day we moved in. Our new neighbors left gift baskets, and when the weekend came, 2 girls from the house across the street knocked on our door asking if I wanted to come hang out. Their names were Jenny and Joy, age 14 and 12, and they walked me over to the basketball courts to show me where kids hung out on weekends. There was the softball field, the 2 basketball courts and the tennis court, and then a big wall of trees with some woods behind them. Jenny and Joy said everyone's parents were cool with them hanging out there because everyone could keep an eye on them from the street. But we were never to walk beyond the woods, and that reason had a name. Trent Baxter. According to Jenny and Joy, the Baxters lived in the Manor Road apartments on the other side of the woods, and 15-year-old Trent was the biggest bully in all of the county. His dad was in jail, I guess, and his mom was a drunk, and young Trent had been so badly behaving in school that he'd been removed from the school system altogether around age 12. He used to get into fights with other kids, throw chairs at his teachers, and one time, they said, he even drowned the class hamster by trying to flush it down the toilet. Luckily, Trent knew better than to go wandering around our street or near the basketball courts, because every time he did, the town councilman would see him from his office and threaten to call the town sheriff. As a result, Trent mostly moped around the woods near the Manor Road apartments, setting rabbit traps and starting fires. And I appreciated the heads up, but since Trent didn't hang out at the courts and he didn't go to school, I didn't think that he'd be any sort of problem for me. But I could not have been more wrong. It was during our first meeting that Jenny and Joy gave me their general warning about the Baxters. Then that Friday, they walked across the street and asked if I wanted to come hang out with them and some other kids down at the basketball courts. And it was here that I got my second and more specific warning about Trent. Down at the courts, a kid named Stevie told me that when Trent found out a new family had moved into town, he was furious. Stevie also lived at the Manor Road apartments, but unlike Trent, he wasn't a predatory miscreant who broke, burned, or stole everything that wasn't nailed down. He'd come hang out on a Friday and a Saturday night, often with tales of Trent's trials and tribulations over at the apartments. According to Stevie, Trent would target an older widower who lived on the ground floor, banging real loud on his door because he knew the guy had a heart condition. He'd also target his neighbor's cats and dogs, and there was a rumor that he fed one a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, with ground-up glass as the secret ingredient. But that Friday night, and to my absolute horror, I learned Trent's newest target was my family. And like I said, Stevie mentioned Trent being furious when he heard we'd moved into town and had overheard him saying that he was going to burn our house down. Jenny and Joy, along with these other kids, assured me that Trent said stuff like that all the time, directed at just about everyone, but only rarely did he go through with any of his threats. I'd like to be able to say that reassured me, but if Trent really was just all bark and no bite, how had he managed to earn such a bad reputation? That evening, after I returned home from hanging out at the basketball courts, I told my mom what I'd heard about this Trent Baxter threatening to burn down our house. She'd also heard stories about the Baxters from some of the neighbors that had stopped by our place. Some pretty frightening things, too. But she knew that the people in East Corinth were mostly good, salt-of-the-earth folks who wouldn't allow the Baxters to terrorize anyone, let alone the newest arrivals. And that was a lot more reassuring than anything the kids at the basketball courts said. I still really appreciated them being so welcoming, but nothing sounds truer as when it's coming from Mom, right? I figured the whole Trent Baxter situation might be a storm in a teacup, so to speak. But again, I was wrong. One night, about a week after moving into our new home, I woke up in the middle of the night to a very loud crash coming from downstairs. My dad grabbed his gun from the closet, ran downstairs to see what was happening, and then walked into the family room to find someone had thrown a brick through the window. And attached to the brick was a note saying, "Move." And that's all it said. Dad reported the incident to the county sheriff the next day, who sent out a deputy who'd grown up just north of town. Deputy Daniels said that he was familiar with the Baxters and would try to ascertain Trent's whereabouts from the previous night, but he also said it probably wouldn't be easy. As I already mentioned, it was known around town that Trent's dad was in jail and wasn't coming home anytime soon. According to the deputy, Trent's mom wasn't so much a sedentary drunk as she was a wanderer. She'd disappear for days at a time, and if you did manage to catch her, there was no guarantee she'd remember the exchange the next time you talked. Apparently, Trent often ran off and slept in the woods whenever he was in trouble, and his mom was more concerned with chasing bottles and boyfriends than she ever was with her own son. Finding him would be much easier said than done, and even if he did find him, Deputy Daniels wouldn't be able to do anything without concrete proof that it was Trent who'd thrown that brick. The only good news the deputy had was that it was unlikely Trent would try the same thing twice. He was a spontaneous kid of spitefulness, not a focused one, and as long as we stuck it out a little, he'd eventually get bored of us and just sort of move on, he said. I remember watching them fit in a new window with my dad talking about how it was just growing pains. There's always bad people any place you go, he'd say. But here, there's just one or two, not thousands like back in Providence. And Mom agreed. She said all Trent Baxter needed was a short, sharp shock to make it clear that we were not to be messed with, and then he'd just leave us alone. Dad stayed up late a few nights, sitting in the dark in the family room, looking out of our newly fitted windows into the street outside. He didn't keep his gun with him, he just wanted to catch Trent in the act and scare him a little. But Daniels appeared to be right, and Trent never showed. At school, Joy told me that she and Jenny had heard about Trent breaking our windows, and that they were very sorry that he'd chosen to target us. It was definitely scary, having such friendly, supportive people around. It did make things easier to bear, though. Joy said the same thing the deputy did, and that if Trent ever did get a whiff that he was the prime suspect, he'd probably disappear for a few days and we'd be able to carry on in peace. And she was right in a way, because the next few days and nights went on without incident. And as I said, we got the window replaced, Dad stopped sitting up late in our dark family room, and for about a week at least, it seemed like Trent had moved on. But then, the birds showed up. One morning after realizing that we were all out of milk, Dad decided to walk down to the general store to buy a carton or two. But he took just one step out of the front door and froze. He had a Cadillac Fleetwood broom, a real beauty, but all over the hood and roof were a bunch of dead and disemboweled birds. It looked like someone had gutted them on the spot because the insides were splayed out next to them, having pulled through slits which had been cut into their bodies. Whoever had done it had taken the heads off too, and at first, they were nowhere to be found. Dad takes one good look at the cadaver-covered car, turns back around, and then walks inside the house to call the county sheriff. He then spends the next hour or so disposing of the headless birds and hosing down his Cadillac until it was spotless again. And once he'd finished, and because he'd wasted a bunch of his morning cleaning off his car and talking to the cops, Dad figured that he'd drive down to the general store in order to claw back a few minutes of his day. Dad said that he'd climb into the driver's seat, then slid his key into the ignition, but when he turned it, there was nothing but a muffled sputter from the car's engine. He said he kind of just frowned and checked the choke and then tried again, but then instead of starting like it normally would, there was a strange, high-pitched whine from the rear like air was escaping a balloon. He started to panic a little as a series of dull thumps sounded from underneath, and then suddenly there was this huge boom as something exploded out of the car's tailpipe. Dad said he jumped up and then ran around to the rear of the car, only to see blood dripping from the exhaust. And then splattered on the ground behind it were all the little heads of the dead bird that had been lying on his car. That afternoon, Deputy Daniels was back in our kitchen talking with my mom and Dad over a few cups of coffee. and he recommended that Dad park his car in the garage from then on, and that when he caught up with Trent Baxter, he'd be arrested on suspicion of animal cruelty. A brick is a brick, but hurting animals like that was exactly the kind of behavior people had come to expect from Trent the Troll, as some kids called him. He was probably laying low, said Deputy Daniels, especially after the bird incident. It was also very likely Trent was angry that we dared to call the sheriff and wanted to give us one last FU before he backed off for good. At least, that's what Mom and Dad had chose to believe. Yet it proved to be nothing but wishful thinking. About 2 weeks went by and we'd once again assumed that we were in the clear, when one morning, someone started banging on our door at around 8. Dad went downstairs in his slippers to see who it was, only to find the mailman, looking white as a sheet and pointing at something that sat on our doorstep. It was a plastic can of gas, along with a box of matches, and the can actually had some gas in it too. It was Trent. He was leaving us a message, and one that clearly said, "Leave, because next time, I might go through with it." The appearance of that can marked the third time that Deputy Daniels came over to our house, but that time, Mom and Dad weren't quite so patient and understanding as before. I distinctly remember my dad telling him to do his damned job, and that if the deputy couldn't find a juvenile delinquent like Trent Baxter, then he was in the wrong line of work. And to his credit, Deputy Daniels took Dad's comments on the chin. He said he understood his frustration, but that it was something that most other folks have felt at some point too. Trent and his family were this dark cloud that hung over the town, and much like all the other dark clouds which pass over the state of Maine, and boy are there many, you learn to live with them. On the bright side, Trent had never burned anything down before, at least nothing as big as a house, but as you can probably guess, that didn't reassure my dad one bit. The deputies and our neighbors could be as supportive as they liked, and it was all much appreciated, but they couldn't keep an eye out for us all the time, and the nights seemed to belong to Trent. By the time the gas and the box of matches showed up on our doorstep and my dad was yelling in Deputy Daniels' face, I was starting to get really, really upset by the whole thing. After about a month of being there, I actually liked living in East Corinth. I liked my new friends. I liked the idea of starting high school there too, so the idea that some fire-obsessed, bird-murdering psycho was about to ruin all of that for us, let's just say it started to weigh on me. Especially the day when I found out Trent wanted to target me, specifically. It was a Friday at lunchtime and I was getting myself some food in the school cafeteria when Stevie from over the road sat next to me in Joy. And right away I could tell that he had something to say, and when he did, I felt my appetite leaving as this feeling of dread crept over me. Stevie said that he'd been riding his bike out near the apartments when Trent Baxter came out of the bushes, yelling for him to stop. Stevie knew he could outpedal him if he needed to, so he stopped and asked him what his problem was. Trent asked Stevie if he's friends with the new kid, i.e. me, and then when Stevie said yes, Trent told him that the new kid was, and I quote, dead meat. Since we hadn't got the message about leaving town, Trent was going to have to up the ante, and upping that ante meant targeting me. I was terrified, and the only thing that stopped me from descending into a full-on panic were Joy and Stevie's reassurances. They promised me that if I came to hang out with them that evening after school, they'd do anything and everything to protect me from Trent. Bullies like that were only ever successful if they could isolate someone, when there wasn't that strength in numbers. So if I stuck with them, Trent wouldn't be able to touch me and I'd be fine. What I felt in that cafeteria was one of the most bittersweet moments of my whole life. I don't think that I've ever been so scared of someone before, but I'd also never experienced such kindness and acceptance before either. I was so grateful that I was holding back tears by the time I gave Joy a hug and thanked her for all that she and her sister had done for me, in terms of making me feel welcome, introducing me to my new friend group, and most importantly, protecting me from the town's resident psycho. When I got home from school that afternoon, I told my mom everything Stevie and Joy had said in the cafeteria. She said that I was really lucky to have such nice new friends, but if I saw Trent at any point during that evening, I was to run home immediately so that her and Dad could call the sheriff. She had no doubt that my nice new friends could keep their eyes out for him. She even figured they'd try and defend me if need be. But the bottom line was that at the first sign of trouble, I should just walk or even run away. and that way I could avoid any trouble before it even started. I remember suggesting that if a deputy or town councilman saw Trent doing something violent, then they could actually do something about him instead of just beating around the bush all the time and letting him run riot. I mean, sure, I might end up with a few bruises and a black eye, but if that's what we needed to get Trent out of the picture, then maybe it was a price worth paying. And Mom gave me a very concrete no to that suggestion and explained that violence in the movies is a hell of a lot different to violence in real life. Only in the movies did people walk away from fights with nothing but a split lip and a good story. In real life, one punch was all it took to put one person in the ground and the other in jail for the rest of their lives. Mom wanted to see this Baxter kid punished, just like everyone else in town did, just not at the expense of her only daughter. And late that afternoon, around 5:30, Jenny and Joy stopped by our house, and then we walked down to the basketball courts to hang out again. All of the usual kids were there, either shooting some hoops or riding their bikes around the courts, and although I was kind of tense at first, I soon started to relax as we fell into the usual rhythm of things. Maybe an hour into hanging out, I was really enjoying myself, and I'd also totally forgotten about the whole Trent thing when Stevie comes riding his bike across the fields away from the woods shouting, "Trent's coming, Trent's coming." Everyone kind of flew into a panic for a second because this one older kid, Ryan, started yelling about how he was sick of running and how we should fight back for once instead of just going to get the adults. I didn't like the sound of that, not after what my mom had said about avoiding violence. But most of the other kids, instead of just leaving, latched onto what Ryan said and were basically saying stuff like, "Yeah, let's get him." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a movie, and beside me, Jenny and Joy were both saying, come on, let's go make sure he leaves you alone." It was odd, but I thought about the smashed window, the birds, and that can of gas, and I got angry. I loved my new home, and I wasn't about to let some scumbag ruin it for me. Ryan and the other kids started storming across the field yelling about how they were going to kick Trent Baxter's ass. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen, and as I watched, I stood up and then told Jenny and Joy, "All right, let's go." And they were smiling and clapping, and then after following me over to the field, we ran to catch up with the kids ahead of us. When we got to the tree line, we kind of fanned out a little and then started looking all over for this Trent character. We walked deeper and deeper into the woods, and the setting sun in the sky was ahead of us, but since we were together, we weren't very scared. I remember stopping at one point and looking around. If Trent Baxter had been in those woods, he sure as heck wasn't there anymore. And I turned to Jenny, Joy's older sister, and then said something like, Look, he's gone." But the way she was looking at me was wrong. Very wrong. I know I'd only known her a few weeks, but I'd never seen her make a face like that before. Yet it wasn't just her that was staring at me with very cold eyes. It was everyone. I turned around on the spot and realized that they all started walking towards me. And then right behind me, I heard Jenny say, "That's where you're wrong. Trent Baxter's right here." And I turned just in time for Jenny to shove me backwards into the dirt as she yelled, "Here!" And I fell on my butt. But the pain of her turning on me dwarfed any I felt from the impact. I asked her what she was doing, but she didn't answer. And then I heard someone yell something terrible about me from my right before someone kicked me in the side of the head. I immediately went down, clutching my head, and that's when everyone jumped in and started kicking me. "Trent Baxter's right here," someone repeated, and the others laughed, but they never stopped kicking me. All I could do was just lie there, shielding my head from those blows, while I felt their sneakers and shoes smashing into my arms and my ribs and my back and my butt. I soaked it all up until someone tried stamping on my head, and that's when I realized I had to move. I felt like if I didn't, they'd kill me. I managed to make it to my knees before someone shoved me down again. Then the stamping and kicking and punching continued for a minute until I kind of just threw myself forward and made it to my feet again. That time I was able to run. They tried kicking my legs out from under me, but it didn't work, and I was able to get a real sprint going. The kids ran after me, and I remember looking over my shoulder, seeing them, and then feeling this surge of adrenaline take hold of me. And I ran, and I ran, and I ran. until I was all the way back to my street before I realized that I wasn't being followed anymore. I remember looking back over my shoulder again and thinking, where the hell are Jenny and Joy? They lived just over the street from me, so wherever they'd run to, it hadn't been home. But then as I got closer to my house, I could see people gathered outside, and when I saw who it was, my heart sank. It was my mom, one of the ladies who lived across the street from us, along with Jenny and Joy. I was still in so much shock that when my mom ran over to escort me into the house, I didn't say anything. I wanted to get the blood off of me, get the dirt out of my mouth, and I didn't want to look at Jenny or Joy for a single second longer than I had to. Then as Mom sat me down and got out the Band-Aids and antiseptic wipes, she kept saying to me, "Trent Baxter's going to pay for this, sweetie. You just wait and see. The only folks they're going to be moving out of this town are him and his mom when they're carted off to jail." I didn't know how to tell her right away. I didn't even cry at first. I just sat there quietly letting her wipe the blood from my face and hands, almost like the calm before the storm. I was in shock. And a few hours later, after I'd cried my eyes out finally and gotten a long hot bath, I walked into the TV room and just told her straight up, "Mom, it wasn't Trent Baxter who beat me up. It was the kids who hang out at the basketball courts. It was all of them." And she was stunned. And if you hadn't already guessed, Jenny and Joy had ran ahead of me to tell everyone it was Trent Baxter who'd ambushed me after I'd wandered into the woods. So, to have me telling her something different, and that in fact there might not even be a Trent Baxter to begin with, it all came as an obvious shock to her. She was in denial at first, talked about how our neighbors had mentioned the Baxters on more than one occasion. It wasn't out of the question that a bunch of kids were all just in on some cruel joke. But the whole town. It wasn't until Dad called the county sheriff and asked to speak with him directly that he too realized something was going on. The sheriff had someone run some files, only to discover that there hadn't been a Baxter family living in East Corinth since 1934. Dad then gave him an earful about Deputy Daniels and how one of his peace officers had lied to his face about having met Trent Baxter and his mother. But when accused, Deputy Daniels played dumb and said that he was just trying to reassure the newcomers that he could keep them safe. The sheriff apologized for his deputy, saying that he was just young, dumb, and eager to impress. But Dad didn't buy it, and he too began to realize the same thing I had. There were no Baxters living in those apartments. The townsfolk had invented them. It took a few days of subtle investigation before Dad moved us back to Providence. He said he wanted to be sure before he got us packing our bags. But when he was sure, when he'd driven out to that road to ask around and was certain that the Baxters were some fabrication, we got the hell out of town and never looked back. Dad said he tried talking to the sheriff about it, and that he tried explaining how the people of East Corinth invented the Baxters as a way of terrorizing each other and terrifying outsiders. But the more he talked, the more the sheriff seemed to act like he was crazy. The sheriff said that he'd spoken to the townspeople, to the mayor and to the town councilman, and not a single person had mentioned anything about any Baxter family. It was a damn shame what was happening to that new family, they said, but as much as they wanted to help, there was nothing they could do. Once Dad realized the extent to which the townsfolk were willing to hoodwink us, he decided to quit while he was ahead and just simply get us to safety as soon as possible. And we moved back to Providence, checked into a hotel, and then stayed in an apartment for a while before Dad could find us a more permanent place to live. And we rarely speak of East Corinth, but it was always there. I guess no one wanted to remind each other or remind ourselves that the move had ever happened, but it had, and there was no getting away from it. And every so often I thought about that area and why people acted the way they did. I guess the idea of the Baxter family was something they used to blame all their problems on at first. And then maybe over time, the Baxters became something they'd use to solve their problems, namely the problem of newcomers, and how to keep them out of their town, for good. It was mid-March. My friends and I were in our early 20s and really into backpacking, hiking, camping, etc. Living in the Pacific Northwest, we were definitely in the right area to satiate our cravings for the outdoors. We wanted to go on a weekend camping trip, so earlier in the week, we went out scouting for an area to camp. After we drove a ways out of town, we found a rural road that looked pretty promising. A few miles down the road, we came to an intersection. We could continue straight where the paved road turned to gravel, turn left to be near a creek about 20 feet from the road, or turn right onto what looked like a little used, mostly grass-covered road. We decided to turn right and see what the area held. The grassy road followed a gentle left curve for about 100 yards and then opened up to a small roundabout with a flat, campground-looking area to the right of it. The site looked like it had been used plenty of times, but there was a lot of untouched grass on the road and a flat area, so we assumed no one had been there in a while. We liked the spot, but it was a little close to the road for us, so we decided to get out and have a look around. Shortly into our inspection, we found a trail that went deeper into the woods. We hiked up it for a quarter mile or so and really liked the way it looked. It was rural enough that we could really feel like we were in the outdoors, and there was no pesky cell reception to distract us from Mother Nature. After deciding this would be our spot for the upcoming weekend, we packed up and headed home. Once we got back to cell service, one of us used Google Maps to make sure our prospective campsite wasn't on anyone's property. To our relief, we were in the clear for several miles around the area. We decided that since we were able to get Friday off work, we would pack up Thursday after getting home and head out that night to squeeze the most out of our trip. Fast forward to Thursday night. All of our gear was packed and we had all the food, water, and illicit substances we would need for 3 days of unwinding in the woods. As we pulled up the familiar grassy road and came around the bend, we saw the reflection of our headlights glaring back at us from the darkness, like the eyes of a large demon, angry that we'd intruded on its slumber. It was the taillights of a parked car. Our hearts collectively dropped as we slowed to a stop and decided what to do. We could hear a dog barking and saw a tent set up near the car, so we decided to turn tail and head home in defeat. After regrouping at home, we decided that if we tried again the following night, it would be enough time that hopefully whoever was there would have packed up and left. Fast forward to Friday night, we pulled up and the car was still there, along with the tent and the barking dog. Big letdown for sure, but after a brief talk amongst ourselves, we decided to risk it and stay. We parked on the roundabout about 50 feet away from the car and tent and hiked up the trail so we could be away from whoever was already there. We got out and the dog's barking reached a feral crescendo. Based on the fact that it hadn't already come over and started mauling us, we assumed it was leashed up or something. We quickly put on our packs and hiked up the trail in the dark with our flashlights on. It was a creepy walk, especially since everyone was practically holding their breath in fear of someone coming out to yell at us for trespassing or ruining their night or something, but nothing happened. After making it to a good spot and setting up camp, we got right to partying. We joked about what the camper or campers we passed must be thinking or doing right now and tried to scare each other with half-cocked theories about whoever it was and what they might do to take revenge on us for barging in on their quiet evening. Little did we know, the memory of our trip would be ruined in a way that none of us could have guessed. Eventually, we all fell asleep and the next day rolled around. I spent that Saturday hiking further up the trail and exploring. Nothing major happened, and we ended the night much the same way that we did the previous one. Sunday is when the story takes a turn. Everyone was tired, hungover, and pretty much ready to go back to civilization, so we started hiking back to the car. When we got there, we all noticed a complete shift in the atmosphere. I can only describe the scene as eerie. It felt like all the life had been sucked out of the wilderness. For the first time since arriving, the woods were completely silent. The car was still there and so was the tent, but we didn't hear the dog barking anymore. Being daylight now, we could see more of the encampment. It was unusual to say the least. The car was up on the type of little ramps people use for working on their vehicles. The tent was open, and there was a plastic fold-up picnic table set up next to the car with all kinds of things on it. Motor oil, transmission fluid, automotive tools, a gallon of milk with the lid off, paper plates, miscellaneous food items, etc. And it looked like someone was working on their car in the middle of the woods and stopped to prepare a meal, only to seemingly vanish into thin air. Curiosity took over better judgment, and we decided to have a look. Walking cautiously through the campsite, we looked for any clues about why the person or people could have left in such a hurry, and my mind immediately went to the missing 411 cases. One of my friends pointed out that the windows of the vehicle were heavily fogged up, so we tried our best to peer inside. The windows were also pretty heavily tinted, so looking through them proved difficult, but the fog hadn't quite reached the edges of the glass. This made it possible to just barely see the silhouette of a large dog in the back seat. It sat there upright and panting hard, but not moving or making any other noise, and my heart sank. It was Sunday morning, and for all I knew, that dog had been trapped in this car since Thursday night when we first arrived. I assumed that's why it wasn't barking anymore. It probably didn't even have the energy and was likely badly dehydrated. We debated what to do and decided trying to break a window or open a door to let the dog out was a bad idea, since it could be violent or hurt itself on the broken glass trying to get out itself. We didn't have cell reception. We decided with heavy hearts that the best choice would be to drive back to town and call animal control as soon as we had service. We left, and I made the call and did my best to explain the situation to the person who answered. He told me he would head out to the area in a few hours and update me on how it went, and I thanked him, and that was the end of the call. I waited around for hours to hear back from the guy, and I started getting restless. Worried for the well-being of the dog, I ended up calling him back when it reached around 7 p.m. He said he tried to follow my instructions, but to my dismay, he mistakenly continued straight down the gravel road for several miles rather than turning right onto the grassy road. He had actually just gotten back to cell phone service when I called. He told me that he would head back there the next day and try again, as it was getting late and he had other calls that he had to get to. And I was distraught. I started debating heading out there myself to let the dog out of that vehicle, but ultimately decided it would be best to let the professionals handle it. I had no idea how good that decision was at the time. The next day I heard nothing back from the animal control guy despite several calls from me, and by about 7 p.m. I was really frustrated, desperately hoping for the best, but ultimately fearing the worst. That's when one of my friends, who had been silently browsing her phone for a while, suddenly gasped. When we asked what was wrong, she started reading aloud from her phone, and it was a news story from a city about 4 hours away from ours. To this day, I have no idea how or why they were able to report this news so quickly, and the story roughly went as follows. On Redacted Road, the same one we went down to camp, in the town of Redacted, animal control was called about a dog trapped in the vehicle for several days. When they arrived on the scene, they tried the door of the vehicle, which was locked. The animal control employee called the local deputies, and a state patrol officer who was in the area showed up to assist. Upon shining his flashlight through the tinted window of the vehicle, the state patrol officer was able to identify the body of a woman in the back seat, accompanied by the dog in question. When the local deputies arrived, they were able to open the vehicle and help animal control capture the dog, a pit bull who was very aggressive upon the door being opened. The woman, identified as Redacted, was deceased. Cause of death at this time is unknown. We all sat in silence for about, I kid you not, maybe 10 seconds, and then my phone rang, showing a private number. I answered, and a female voice said, "Hello, this is Detective Redacted. Is this Mr. Redacted?" To which I answered by saying, "Yes, may I ask what this is about?" Or something along those lines, and she asked if I was the person who called in the dog trapped in the car, and I told her that I was. She asked me to explain what had happened, and I told her everything from the Thursday night we went up there until our present phone call, minus the bit about us just having to read the news story. Something in my gut told me that it would be better not to mention what we had just learned, and she seemed surprised and said, "Oh, that's it?" To which I replied, yes, that was all. And as an afterthought, I asked how the dog was doing, and she said it was alive and in the hands of animal control. And I then asked if she needed anything else from me, and she said no, but that I would hear from her if anything else came up. The call ended, and we all started talking at once, asking each other if anyone had touched the vehicle or anything at the campsite, and to our relief, it appeared none of us had. We couldn't help but imagine what would happen had we broken a window to rescue that poor dog. The next day I called the animal control guy and introduced myself and apologized for his experiences after explaining that we saw a news story about what we had found. I asked him what would become of the dog, and he told me it was going to the Humane Society and that they were going to try to rehabilitate it. Apparently, it had been trapped in that vehicle so long that it started eating the person who was in there with it. I asked if I could come visit the dog, and he said that right now the dog was technically evidence related to the case and that I couldn't see it, but he would let me know if anything changed. After a few weeks of waiting and wandering, I called the Humane Society to ask about the dog and was told they regrettably had to put it down. I guess there was just no coming back from what that poor thing went through, and I didn't get or ask for any more details. Eventually, we got word about the coroner's report. The woman was transient, a mother with an ex-husband and a 9-year-old son. She died from a drug overdose. Time of death was recorded to have happened at approximately midnight of the very same Thursday that we first went to the campsite and saw her car. After all this time, I Googled the old news story about what had happened just to refresh my memory on the details, and what I found really took me by surprise. According to several other news stories that came up in my search results, stretching back to at least as early as 16 years before our event took place and up until the current year of 2025, there had been a surprising number of mysterious deaths that occur on that specific road that we found. We haven't been back to that neck of the woods since, and probably never will. This happened about a year or so ago, but I just read something fairly familiar and it reminds me of how it still gives me the chills. I have 3 kids who are around 9, 7, and 2 at the time, and also living with my husband. We live fairly rural in the UK, just on the outside of a small village. Every night I always check the door is locked and sometimes even the chain put across as well. This night, I was woken up very abruptly by a harsh banging on the front door. At first, I thought that it was just someone drunk, thinking it was their house, but then they started trying to turn the handle. My husband wasn't near the door, and I stood on the stairs with my phone in case I needed to call someone. My husband told the man he had kids in the house who were sleeping and to go away right now. The man started rambling and slightly slurring his speech. It wasn't extreme slurring, but his voice wasn't quite right. It seemed clear that he was either on something or mentally unwell. He kept asking for a certain woman by name, and my husband told him that there was no one by that name here and to go away. And the man kept insisting that we were hiding her and said he was coming in. During this time, there were a lot of strange sounds coming from behind the door. Thumping, scratching, and another sound that I couldn't quite place. My husband then told him that I had called the police. He gave a few more frantic thumps and then, I assume, left because we heard nothing else. We didn't hear anything like him attempting this with the neighbors either. And for a few hours I waited in case he came back. I had a tennis racket that I would have used if I had to, and luckily it didn't come to that. In the morning, since it was a weekend, I decided to go check outside, and honestly, I felt a little ill. There was a massive dent in the door, which I thought surely couldn't have been caused by a fist alone. Then, on the door and the panels near it, were fingernail marks and blood. It was enough that it needed to be washed off. Between the door and where the bins are, there was a smashed ashtray, also with blood on it in lots of pieces. One of the outdoor plants had been tipped over with the plant and soil all over the ground. My best guess is he tried to smash the door with the ashtray and cut himself, but that's just speculation. And my blood ran cold thinking about how clearly aggressive this man was, and we have absolutely no reason to be targeted. We told our neighbors, who were absolutely horrified, and they said they thought they heard something but just assumed it was a drunk. When we mentioned the woman's name, the neighbor says, "Oh God, that's," said her name. "She used to live where you do, a few doors down." She used to be into drugs and had a few shady people around, and the neighbor reckons maybe one of her old drug-using companions was searching for her. And even now, there have been a few incidents at her house where the police have been called, but I'm not sure what for. Now we have a video doorbell and alarms fitted, so at least a button now goes straight to a security system that, if you don't answer, will send the authorities. It didn't end in danger, but it so easily could have, and that's what's scary as hell. So seriously, she doesn't live here. And to the absolutely insane door-knocking guy, please, never come again. This begins when I was 15. I'm 18 now, and just for some background, I work in a 5-star Michelin restaurant as a waitress in a sweet little area. And we usually don't get anyone with bad intentions, usually just snobs. On Easter Sunday of 2022, one of the busiest days of the year, a man who will be known as the Easter Man came looking for a table for one. He was in a 3-piece suit, carrying a carton of chicken eggs. He was seated in my section, so I went over to get his drink and food order. And once I got his order, he kept talking, asking about my education, what I was doing in school, and what my plans were for the future, what my hobbies were, my name, etc., etc. It was just a little too much to be polite, but I let it slide. I was busy, tired, and I didn't want any trouble, and eventually he left for the day, and I thought that was that. And oh, was I wrong. For the next couple of months, he would come in 2 to 3 days every week. He got more confident, attempting to flirt with me, asked me to come out with him after work, etc. However, things just got worse during one shift. I was walking him to his table and he slid his hands down my back and over my butt. I turned around and somehow politely told him not to touch me and not to push my boundaries as I was only 15, and he knew that. And I didn't serve him that day. Now a week later, he comes in and I refused to serve him again. My manager took over his table, yet when everybody was on break and I was the only one on the floor, he came inside, and he knew by this point that it was table service only, and he came up behind me, bringing his hands down my arms. I was shaken up, but politely again told him not to touch me. And I didn't hear from him again until next Easter, 2023. Last Easter, things got worse. He showed up again with his usual shenanigans. However, my managers were prepared this year, not allowing me to go near him and keeping me safe, though this was only useful inside of work. I walk through the town center to get to work. It's about a 25-minute walk from the train station. As I was walking to work one day, he saw me from his car and followed me into work, and I immediately told my managers, who again told me to stay away from him. A week later, I was having coffee before work and about a 50-minute walk from my job. What do you know? Guess who sees me and follows me on foot to work? I told my managers again, who kept me away from him again. Yet that day was different. He asked my managers for me, saying he knew I was there because he'd seen me. Now last year, 2024, I took a lot of holidays around Easter time and was off for exams. Supposedly he came in a few times asking for me and didn't come in much when I wasn't anywhere to be seen. It's just truly terrifying that I have a stalker who shows up every Easter. This is a completely true story, and it happened just an hour ago, and I wanted to talk about it somewhere. Now for context, my wife and I were on vacation in Mexico. We're both honestly loving it here, and the situation doesn't change that, but I am reevaluating security. My wife and I went out to dinner and walked back to our hotel. We got inside our room, we're setting things down and all that, and a few minutes go by and there's a knock at the door. A man quietly says something in Spanish, in an inflection that's clearly trying to get our attention. Think room service or something. My wife looks at me, wondering who would be at the door. And at this point, I should clarify that we had the Do Not Disturb tag on the door. A few seconds go by and there's a knock. My wife signals for me to go to the door, so I go over. At this point, we've made no sounds for probably a minute before and during the knocks. And just as I reach the door, the key card unlocks it, and it opens. A dirty-looking man is standing there, about 2 feet from my face. I put my hand on the door to prevent it from opening any further, and I think he was as surprised as I was. He starts speaking in Spanish and I hear the word Wi-Fi somewhere in there and I say, "No hablo español." In broken English, he tries to ask if the Wi-Fi is down. My wife says it's not. I'm just kind of shell-shocked by what just happened, and I keep my hand on the door as he talks and eventually leaves. I shut the door and engage the physical lock this time. I usually do this, but we had just walked in and we're setting our stuff down. I talk with my wife as we try to gather our thoughts about what had just happened. Essentially, a man knocked, got no reply, and then let himself in and asked about our Wi-Fi. No, this was a clear burglary attempt. He had a master key card and thought that we weren't home. A minute or two after this went down, once we collected ourselves and understood what just occurred, I passed the information to the front desk in case this guy attempts other doors. They seemed to take it pretty seriously, but there were no updates beyond that. The fact that this just happened has my mind kind of blown, and I don't know if I've fully processed it yet. Like, what if we were back 30 minutes later? Probably would have lost some stuff. 5 minutes later, we walk in on a guy in our hotel room. What if we'd gone to bed earlier tonight? We could have been asleep. The AC is loud and I don't know if I would have heard the knocking through my sleep. If it was going to go down, surely the way it did was optimal, but those ifs are crazy. I'll definitely be storing our valuables in the safe now. Should have done that already, but we just recently got here. Lesson learned, I guess. In the future, stuff is going immediately into the safe and the lock is getting engaged right away. This happened a few years ago and I never told anyone about it. I don't know why I'm posting it here now, but it's been on my mind again and I just need to get it out. At the time, I lived pretty far out in the country, just me and my dog, no close neighbors, and it was usually really quiet and I liked it that way. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the motion sensor light going off outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but when I looked out the window, I saw a man standing at the end of my driveway. He wasn't moving, just standing there facing my home. I don't know why, but I froze. I just stood there staring at him and he didn't move at all. The lights went off after a while and everything went back to dark and quiet, and I didn't sleep much after that. The next night, it happened again. The light came on and there he was. Same spot, same stillness, just standing there staring at my home. By this point, I was starting to get really freaked out, so I called the sheriff's department, and they sent someone to check it out, but by the time they got there, this guy was already gone. The deputy told me that it was probably just some drunk guy or someone passing through and that I shouldn't worry unless he started coming closer. But that didn't make me feel any better, but I tried to move on. This went on for about a week. Every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up and see him standing there at the end of the driveway. And it was always the same. He never moved, never said anything, just stood there staring at my house. And it got to the point where I started closing the blinds at night, but I still felt like I could feel him out there. And then, just like that, it stopped. I never saw him again after that week, with no explanation, no reason. It just ended. I've never told anyone about this before. It's probably not that big a deal, but it's something that's obviously stuck with me. I guess I just needed to write it down. It was just past midnight and my wife and I were in bed. She was asleep and I was watching TV trying to fall asleep. All of a sudden, I heard a loud thud at the back door. Our master bedroom is at the front of the house. Then I heard a bunch of bumps all along the walkway on the side of the house, and meanwhile, the dog was losing his mind. There was pounding at the front door. I thought it might be the cops or some kind of emergency, so I jumped out of bed and turned to the corner to the front door, only to see a girl, probably in her 20s, very small, yelling, let me in, 4 men in a van, they're hunting me." And I'm just responding, "What the F is going on?" as she's pounding on the front door. I looked around and didn't see anyone. I told her as much, but then my wife rounded the corner and said to let her in. The girl ran in with no shoes on, wearing muddied pajama pants. I told her to sit down and said that I'd check things out. As I was putting on pants, she starts yelling, "They're right here, 4 men. They want to murder me. There's one aiming at me. They want to kill me." But there was no one. She started running around our house, jumped on our bed and slammed our window shut, and then ran into the guest room, then the bathtub, and then the laundry room. At that point, I was losing my patience, so I told her, "Go to the couch and sit down. There's no one out there. If you live 2 blocks away, I'll drive you." And that was a big mistake. At this point, I realized that she was unhinged and probably experiencing some kind of neurological episode. I just wanted her out of the house, so I got the car while my wife brought her outside. I checked the mirrors, totally empty streets. The girl started saying that they were crawling on my car, and I assured her that they weren't and asked for her address. 16th Avenue and 15th Street, she said. I told her that didn't exist in this neighborhood. She screamed and said they were coming. We hadn't even left yet. I told her again, no one was out there. I asked her for directions if it was close, and I followed the rough 2 blocks that way she mentioned earlier. She started spitting out wrong addresses, and everywhere she said it should be, it wasn't. And then she covered it up by saying that she was just trying to lose them, crawling around the back seat and checking out the windows. "They're chasing us on scooters. I can see the gun," she yelled. And she shouted, "Go left, right, 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 left." And of course, no one was there. I hit the brakes, and I turned to her and said, "Sit your butt down and put on a seatbelt." And she protested, so I said that I wasn't driving until she did. And then she pointed to a really nice house and said, "That one's mine." And it occurred to me, maybe I was the one in danger. Maybe she was directing me somewhere to get jumped, so I told her, "I'm not driving you anymore. Where do you actually live, and where can I drop you off?" And she said 7-Eleven, so that's where I went. It was just a couple of doors down from my house, and I told her to stay there and called the cops. I ran back home to see if we had any old shoes that she could take, and I assumed that she had taken some kind of weird drug. 5 cop cars ended up combing the neighborhood for a while, and it was obviously her who had made all that ruckus. I hope she got herself figured out, but I left that to the cops. So this happened last night. Around 3 a.m., my brother and I were woken up by loud banging and crying at our front door. We live in a rough neighborhood, so naturally my brother grabbed a shotgun, cocked it loudly, and started yelling, "It's 3 a.m., go away," through the door. We were both tired as hell and freaked out. We'd recently had a girl from the neighborhood break into my car, so we assumed it might actually be her. I looked through the front door's window. We've got a one-way film on it, and didn't see anyone else around. I crouched near the door and listened. It sounded like a young kid, completely hysterical, begging us to help her call her mom. I told her I was calling 911 and that help was on the way. My brother, in full adrenaline mode, opened the door, still holding his shotgun, and started yelling at her to calm down. I didn't agree with his approach, but in all fairness, she had woken up about half the blocks with her screaming while she pressed up against our door. After he opened the door, I got to see her. Honestly, I was kind of hoping it was a homeless person from our area or even someone looking to do some weird stuff to us. But it was a kid. And the look in her eyes while she was kneeling at our doorstep made my heart drop. I was thinking that she was around 14, but she said someone had crashed into her car down the street, and she left her phone in the wreck so she couldn't call her mom. Things weren't really adding up as I asked her a few more questions. She kept begging me to go down the street with her, but I told her no way. We're waiting for the cops. About 10 minutes later, 3 tow trucks drove by heading toward where we told 911 the crash happened, so I felt safe enough to walk with her down the street. On the way, she kept asking to hold my hand, and I'm just thinking, you look like a teenager, you're barely dressed, and I'm a grown man walking through a neighborhood you just woke up. Not a good look. And I awkwardly asked how old she was. She said 18 and grabbed my hand anyway. I felt very uncomfortable, but her emotions were definitely outweighing mine at that time. And halfway there, the cops showed up. I flagged them down and explained the situation. Meanwhile, she kept telling the officers over and over that I have really bad ADHD and anxiety, while handing me her eyelashes. A full set of false lashes. I really didn't want to touch them, but I took them just to help her feel a little safer or whatever. And one of the cops pulled her aside and the others started casually asking me a few questions. He told me they got another call about 30 minutes earlier that a teenager had been running across someone's lawn barefoot, which, when I looked over, realized that she had been barefoot the whole time. Then I saw them cuff her. I think they suspected she was on something, which I myself thought as well. As we were wrapping up, the officers saw me still holding the eyelashes and goes, "What are you gonna do with those, bro?" And I just told him I'll sleep on it. I just want to go back to bed. I headed home and started talking to one of the neighbors about it, and he assumed it was her parents' house or something, so he didn't want to get involved in domestic drama. Makes sense, and I just assumed that's why no one else got involved. I couldn't really go back to sleep because I was shaken up and pretty annoyed about her, and I imagined it was a traumatic experience for her. I don't know if this was a justified reaction for her situation, or if she really was on drugs or mentally ill, but I would definitely be praying for her and her family. So I guess the wildest thing I've ever experienced happened last year, and I still don't know how to explain it without sounding like I'm making it up. You see, it started with these little things going missing. I live alone in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so I figured that I was just being forgetful. A protein bar here, a sock there, whatever. And then my TV would be on a different input than I left it. Nothing huge, just enough to make me second guess myself. The weirdest part, I'd hear these faint bumps in the ceiling sometimes, and I'd chalk it up to raccoons or something. My house is old, stuff creaks, but then one night, I came home late from work and I could swear that I saw a shadow move past the vent opening in the hallway ceiling. I told myself I was tired, imagination, but I couldn't shake that feeling. So I set up one of those cheap motion sensor cameras that I bought off Amazon, pointed it straight at the attic access panel in the hallway. 2 nights later, I get a notification at 2:17 a.m. Motion detected. I opened the clip and my stomach dropped. There was a person climbing down from the attic, like full on, quietly stepping down the ladder, looking around and heading into my kitchen. I froze. I was in the house at the time that clip was taken. I called the cops immediately, locked myself in my room with a bat, freaking out while they did a full sweep. They found no one at first, but when they checked the attic, there was a little setup up there. A sleeping bag, some snacks, a small camping stove, empty water bottles. Someone had clearly been living up there. The person was my neighbor's grown son, who apparently had some drug issues and got kicked out a while back. He broke in when I was on vacation a few months earlier and just never left. He'd sneak down at night to grab some food or watch TV. He got arrested, and I moved out 3 weeks later. I still have trouble sleeping in total silence because now every creak makes me think someone's crawling around above me. Even though this happened almost 10 years ago, I've never been able to get it out of my head, so I thought I'd post here. I was about 11 or 12 years old living in an apartment with my mom. Right across from my apartment was a very creepy neighbor. I could write a whole book about all the creepy, wild, and downright insane things he said and did during the 2 years he was our neighbor, but this is the one thing that stuck with me more than anything else. My mom and this neighbor were having a casual conversation. Her goal was to try to find some common ground with him and clear up any misunderstandings or miscommunications that may have led to him disliking us so much. He had a pretty blatant feeling of disdain towards us, I guess. But evidently, something went wrong during the conversation because my mom suddenly came stomping into our apartment, loudly shutting the door and locking it. She was visibly upset and shaken, so I asked her what was wrong. Her voice was trembling, and she said the neighbor had said this, completely unprompted. "You know, if I were you, I'd keep your daughter away from guys like me." Now, while I'll never know exactly what he meant by that, my mind definitely had plenty of ideas as to what that meant. At the very least, it felt like a thinly veiled threat, and the worst part was that I was often home alone, since I did online school when my mom was at work. And from that point on, I never felt safe being home alone. My imagination ran wild thinking about what he might end up doing to me while I was home alone. Now, I never thought that I'd say something like this, and I feel a little guilty about it, but thankfully, he ended up dying before he ever followed through on his creepy comment. Now also, before anyone asked, my mom only told me what he said because she wanted to warn me to stay away from him and to never, ever leave the door unlocked. I've spent the last 25 years as a ranger at the Wind Cave National Park here in western South Dakota. Teddy Roosevelt established the place back in the early 1900s, and it's one of the first 6 national parks ever founded. But although it's more than 50 square miles of dense forest, mixed grass prairie, and rocky hills, it takes its name from the geological phenomenon that is Wind Cave. Wind Cave is the largest of its kind in the entire world, and has more passage volume per cubic mile than any other on the planet, which, in plain English, means there are more underground tunnels under the park than any other place in the world. On top of that, only around 10% of them have been fully explored, meaning there are thousands of miles of unexplored passageways, and at the going rate, technology permitting of course, it'll take scientists and cavers more than 600 years to fully explore them. The Lakota Native Americans who made the area their home spoke of a living, breathing cave system through which their ancestors had crawled from the underworld during the first days of creation. They called the caves Washanaya, and they played an important role in the culture and creation myths of their people, who speak of Tokahei, or the first man emerging from the darkness. It sounds like classical mythological storytelling, yet the Lakota's belief that Wind Cave is a living, breathing network of tunnels is not entirely unfounded. When high pressure is higher outside the cave than inside it, air flows into the cave, raising the cave's internal pressure to match outside pressure. The process also works in the exact opposite way, meaning that in some of the larger caves, the continuous flow of air really does give the impression that the Earth itself is inhaling and exhaling. As you can imagine, such an incredible natural phenomenon attracts a lot of visitors each year, and for the most part, those visits are safe and uneventful. But one day back in 2003, what started as a fairly routine search for a missing hiker became something I'll never forget. I'd been a ranger at Wind Cave National Park for just over 3 years when the call came in. It was late in the afternoon on a chilly September day when my phone started buzzing. Its screen said Grand Teton, short for Grand Teton Interagency Dispatch Center, so I knew some kind of emergency must be unfolding. When I picked up, the dispatcher told me she'd gotten a call from a panicked hiker who said his friend had followed a child into Wind Cave and neither had come out again. Since this is still technically an open investigation, I'll refer to the missing person as Hiker M out of respect for his family. I know the internet can go crazy with amateur detectives chasing up leads, and I don't want to be the cause of an unnecessary grief to those affected. The caller, on the other hand, I'll refer to as Hiker F, so the missing hiker and his friend. The two men had been hiking down Lookout Point Trail, but when they reached Wind Cave, they saw a lone child running towards its entrance alone. At the time, the cave wasn't attended by any park staff, and since both men knew that the caves weren't a safe area to play, Hiker F claimed they'd called after the child, but the little boy hadn't responded. Concerned for the child's safety, both men ran after him, and then by the time they caught up, they saw the boy crawling into a narrow tunnel. Hiker M followed, assuring Hiker F that he'd return in just a few minutes, but apparently, he didn't come back. After some time, Hiker F followed his friend down the narrow tunnel, calling out for him as he went, but no one responded. Then, rather than risk getting himself lost down there, Hiker F ran back to the surface and then ran another 2 miles to get the cell signal to call 911. First thing I did was alert the superintendent. Then I called the park's search and rescue team and directed them toward Wind Cave. It was early evening by the time I reached the entrance, but the team had already mostly assembled, and within the hour, everyone was on site and ready to go. There were 8 of us, including 2 caving specialists who mapped parts of the cave with the Paja Sapagrado. Hiker F was there too, and he got more and more agitated as he repeated his story to us. See, the first thing Hiker F did after he exited the cave, following the brief search for Hiker M and the child he'd followed, was go looking for the kid's parents. If there was a kid running around, then his parents or teachers or whoever he was with would surely be nearby. So when Hiker F went running out of that cave hollering for help and there was no one around, he obviously got real spooked. I could understand why. I mean, what the hell was a kid doing out there all alone? We didn't have time to dwell on it though. We geared up, our caving specialist took point, and then we entered the cave. The entrance was a tight squeeze, barely 2 feet wide, and I felt that familiar rush of cool air as we shimmied through, and the cave's breathing blew a breeze against my face. Inside, the passage opened slightly, but it was still cramped, with jagged walls and a floor that sloped unevenly. Our headlamps cut through the dark, catching flashes of the delicate blade-like rock formations that almost look like spiderwebs frozen in stone. Our caving specialists traced the path they believed Hiker M most likely took, which took us to a low crawl space branching off the end of the main tunnel. We crawled single file as the passage narrowed even further, forcing us to belly crawl, which made our packs drag against the ceiling. After an hour, we found signs of Hiker M. A torn piece of blue fabric caught on a jagged rock, probably from the jacket he was wearing. This was obviously bad news. Not only had he gone deeper than we'd hoped, but there was a good chance that he was hurt, and if he was hurt, getting him out would be a problem. We pushed onward, following what our cavers thought was the hiker's most likely route. The cave twisted and branched, and our specialists were almost constantly checking their maps, but Hiker M's path didn't follow any known route. From what they could tell, he'd taken turns that led from the developed paths and towards more unexplored sections of the tunnel. And by midnight, we'd advanced no more than around 2 miles, and the passages were only getting tighter. My shoulders brushed the walls, and I had to tilt my head to avoid the ceiling. Before long, we'd found more signs of our missing hiker. A smudged handprint on a tunnel wall, a boot print in a patch of damp clay. Then, in a smaller chamber, I saw something that made my skin crawl. A water bottle, one we later determined belonged to Hiker M, lay half crushed in the corner of the chamber. Next to it was what we determined to be a smear of blood on the wall, fresh enough to glisten in the light of our headlamps. And that's when it became clear Hiker M was hurt, which made our search for him time critical. And we kept going, but it almost felt like the cave itself was fighting back in places. Passages narrowed to little slits, forcing us to backtrack, while one tunnel suddenly dropped off into a pit and showed to be too deep to cross without climbing gear. Another tunnel ended in a pool of dark, still water, and while I'd never actually seen it before, I knew enough about Wind Cave to know that I was looking at Calcite Lake. This was formed millions of years ago by water carving intricate passages through the earth. Calcite Lake glimmered in our headlamps because of the calcite rafts, these thin floating sheets of mineral that drift on its still surface. And around the edge of Calcite Lake is a buildup of silt, and it's that fine damp rock dust that preserved Hiker M's boot print, right there on the edge of the water. The lake isn't deep enough to drown in, not unless a person was laying down unconscious, but if that's what happened to Hiker M, we'd have found his body right there on the surface. And just like everywhere else in those tunnels, our missing hiker was nowhere to be found. Now by 3 a.m., we were exhausted, and we'd gone so deep that our radios were useless. We retreated to the surface to regroup, promising Hiker F that we'd go back for his missing friend in the morning. And maybe 6 or 7 hours later, reinforcements arrived, including a team from the NSS, the National Speleological Society. They were some of the best cavers in the entire country, paid to map out places like the Western Fringe, where reaching underground passages sometimes took days of living like moles. And we split into 3 groups, each taking a different branch from where we'd found the blood. Then within just a few short hours, we found what we suspected to be further traces of Hiker M, including a broken fingernail and another smear of blood. But even after all those cavers covered all those tunnels, we still didn't find our missing hiker. Now by day 3, we were going deeper than most tours ever went. My knees ached and my back was screaming, but I kept crawling, driven by the thought of that poor guy all alone down there in the dark. We didn't find anything that day either, but on the 4th day, we found something that stopped us cold. In a narrow chamber, barely big enough to kneel in, we saw scratches in the clay covering the rocky wall. Deep, frantic gouges like someone had clawed at the stone. One of my team shone his light on the floor, and there was a shredded glove belonging to Hiker M. There was no body, no bones, just the torn up glove and the scratches on the wall. We reported it to the surface, and when we did, I remember how the mood shifted completely. People went from confident and hopeful that we'd get Hiker M back to the surface alive, to wondering how soon the higher-ups would just pull the plug. If a hiker gets lost, even in the tunnels under Wind Cave, finding them can actually be quite a simple process. Most know to stay put and to use flares, fires, or things in their environment to get the attention of the folks looking for them. But people who panic, people who aren't in their right minds, they tend to have real problems staying put. And it's the ones who panic that you really have to worry about, because they make mistakes, sometimes fatal ones too. That night when I got back to my cabin after the day's search, I had trouble getting to sleep. I kept picturing Hiker M, scared out of his mind down there in the dark, with his hands tearing at the rock in desperation. I prayed that he'd stay put, maybe call out a little so we could hear him. But I don't think God passed on the message, because day 5 was the worst of all. One of the volunteer cavers we had with us got stuck in a crawl space. Since he was little more than a brave hobbyist, he panicked and then started thrashing and screaming until we were able to yank him free. We got him to the surface and had a medic look him over, and he was fine, but he refused to go back in. And by day 6, we were running out of options. We'd searched every major branch and followed every lead we had, but there was still no sign of Hiker M. The NSS cavers started mapping new passages, hoping maybe they'd find a hidden chamber that Hiker M was sheltering in. But all they found were more dead ends and more empty caves. One team reported hearing what sounded like a low, breathy wheeze as they traversed sections of the tunnel, but it probably could have been the wind. The cave's breathing played tricks like that, making the wind sound like whispers or worse. In the afternoon, we made a final push past Calcite Lake, to tunnels where the walls were slick and the air felt heavy. We crawled for hours, our lights barely cutting through the darkness, and at one point, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond my beam, but when I swung my light, there was nothing there. On the 7th day, we called it. Our superintendent was the one who made the final decision, but everyone agreed that after 7 days, with no sign of life, there was very little chance that Hiker M was still with us. We'd risked our lives, and I'd have done it all again in a heartbeat if I was told to. But in all that time, we found nothing but little scrapes and blood. Hiker M was down there. We had no doubt about that. But at that stage, we also knew that it might take months, maybe even years, before anyone was able to bring him home. I heard Hiker F broke down sobbing when he got the news that the search had been called off, and we suspected that his friend was deceased. That was a rough one on the superintendent. He just didn't know what to tell that poor guy. And when all was said and done and the search was over, I filed my report, but the question still lingered, obviously. And I kept going back to that cave for work, leading tours and checking paths, but it's really never the same for any of us. We had to upgrade security around the cave entrance to ensure that it didn't happen again, and visitor numbers took a real dive for a while. Months later, a caver found something in a remote section of the tunnel. You see, it was a single hiking boot in Hiker M's size, completely buried in clay. No blood, no other sign of the missing hiker, just that one boot. We added it to the file, but it really doesn't change much. The cave had taken him, and it obviously wasn't giving him back. I still work at Wind Cave, I still walk its trails and the tunnels underneath them, but I don't go deep anymore, not unless I have to. And when I do, I keep my light on and my eyes peeled, and I try not to think about what might be down there in the dark. I have an unusual face. I see people looking when I talk to them, and I catch them staring when I walk past, and they can't help themselves, and it doesn't make me mad or anything. I'd look too if the roles were reversed. Now, I'm not ugly by any standard. I do okay in the dating world, but the story of how I got the face is quite ugly. And since it's one that I feel like I'm getting off my chest as I sent this into you, you get to read about it. So I grew up in Ohio, and although my mom tried her best, I was a bad kid growing up. She had to work a lot to keep her son, i.e. me, clothed and fed, and Grandma was just too damn tired to keep a leash on me, so by the time I was 13, I was running wild almost every night in the company of some equally damaged friends of mine. I say damaged because it was around that same time I found out my dad hadn't just run off. He'd been murdered. And after I found out, I was just mad. All the time, I guess. But so were my friends, and that's how we ended up discovering a mutual love for our favorite pastime, breaking stuff. On a Friday night, we'd head over to places where almost every single house on the street was derelict and boarded up. Then where we could, we'd kick in doors, kick down fences, and smash wooden beams. And we didn't always stick to abandoned houses either. And a lot of the time, we'd pick one or two occupied ones and toss a brick or two through their front windows. We were letting out all the tension, I guess, and I'm not making excuses for myself. That's just how it was back then. We weren't interested in school, and we dropped out as early as we could. And then for the next couple of years, we bummed around, breaking stuff, stealing stuff, and making money where we could. Then one day, a friend of ours got busted for something he didn't even do, and then he ended up going to juvie for it, and I guess that scared me straight. I got my drinking and smoking under control, cut my hair and took out my nose ring, then went around town trying to find somewhere that would give a job to someone with zero work experience doing anything. And well, that place turned out to be Walmart. An employee told me to write to the store's hiring manager explaining my situation, and I didn't think that it'd work, but it did. And I got an interview, explained that I wanted to make an honest living and keep myself out of trouble. The hiring manager told me as long as my background check cleared, he'd give me a shot. And I'd be on probation to start with, meaning they could let me go at any time, no questions asked. But I was willing to prove myself, so he threw me a bone. A week later, I was at orientation doing a bunch of paperwork and watching a bunch of videos. It was tiring, doing all that lifting and walking and dealing with assholes for just minimum wage. My coworkers were kind of standoffish with me to begin with too, so I felt this pressure not to mess up and, I don't know, prove them wrong about me. After a few months, people started to warm up to me and my supervisor started noticing my hard work and enthusiasm. I got more hours, which meant more money, then by the time they were talking about cross-training me as a cashier, I realized they actually trusted me. And that meant a lot. Made me feel like I could be a normal person instead of some scumbag to them. The routine and stability were nice too. It gave me a reason to stay sober. Clocking in, working all day, then going home knowing that paycheck was going to be there no matter what. And it was kind of bliss, and I was actually happy. But I guess that I was living on borrowed time. As one day I was stocking shelves, just doing my thing, when I noticed a guy watching me from down the aisle. You get used to that pretty quick. People were just curious, especially kids. but they usually move on after a second or two once their curiosity is satisfied, and this guy didn't. Instead, and I'm watching out of the corner of my eye, he just stands there, definitely not looking at anything on the shelves, like his face is 100% locked onto me. I made eye contact with the guy as I turned to grab another box. Then, purely out of habit, I say, "Can I help you with anything today, sir?" I figured that might be his deal, like he needed help but was just too shy to ask. But he just smiled and said, No, thank you," and then turned around and walked off. The guy seemed like a little socially awkward, but I'd seen weirder stuff in my time, and I hadn't even reached half a year of employment yet either, so I'd had no doubt that there was more to come. But then 4 days later, on the Saturday shift that I agreed to cover for a coworker, the exact same thing happened again. I was stocking shelves in another area of the store and I saw a figure in the corner of my eye. I didn't recognize him right away. It took a second for the penny to drop, but when it did, I tried to stay as polite and professional as possible and just said, "Hello again, sir. You need help with anything?" It was almost a carbon copy of the first time. He smiled, shook his head, and then walked off without saying anything. Now I'm thinking, okay, this guy's definitely a little off. But Walmart without weirdos is like a day without sunshine, I always say. It just didn't feel like I'd worked a full shift unless I encountered at least one. I mentioned the whole thing to a coworker of mine, but she just sort of laughed like, "Looks like someone's got a crush on you." And we turned the whole thing into a joke like that, much in the same way we did with everything that bothered us about the job. Laughing about stuff burned off a little of the tension, so that the next time something happened, he didn't just explode in the face of a rude customer. I also wasn't too worried because I'd never had a weird customer like that before, and honestly, I didn't think that he'd be back after that second time. But I guess that was more hopeful than anything, because maybe a week or so later, there he was again. I was stocking shelves, I saw him step into the aisle, and after a quick look to see who it was, I remember saying, "Oh, you gotta be kidding me," under my breath before turning to face him. I said, "Hello again, sir," with just enough hardness to my voice to let him know that I didn't appreciate the repeat performance. I wasn't scared or anything. I was more wondering where the hell this was all going and what the guy's angle was. He smiled when I said hello to him, and he said it back very calmly before reaching into his pocket and pulling out his phone. He held it up, looking at something on his screen, then his eyes darted to me for a second and then back to his phone. I figured that he was looking at a product on his phone and he was about to ask if we had it in stock or something. I couldn't figure out why it took him 3 tries to get there, but like I said, it wouldn't be the weirdest thing that had ever happened on shift. But he doesn't show me anything. He just carries on looking back and forth as I noticed something about the hand he was holding his phone with. The back was all scarred up, like an old burn scar, like all pale pink compared to his wrist and fingers. Now I was halfway through saying, "Sir, if there's nothing else I can help you with," when he cut me off and asked, "You don't remember me, do you?" It sounds crazy looking back on it, but I had to sort of tighten my lips to keep from just grinning in his face, because of course I remembered him. Half my coworkers were probably saying to each other, "Hey, check it out, Craig's crush is back and he's asking for his number now." And as the thought entered my head, it almost had me laughing out loud. I told him, "Sure, I remember you, sir. This is the 3rd time we've talked by now." Then in response, the guy just kind of laughed a little as he slid his phone back into his pocket. And then he says, "You really don't remember me, do you?" I guess that was his way of telling me that he knew who I was, but I was wearing my name badge at the time. I legitimately thought that he was just reading it off of that. I asked if I was supposed to remember him, because I didn't, and then asked where he knew me from if it wasn't from Walmart. I was racking my brain the entire time thinking, is this guy an old neighbor or something? Someone from school maybe, or a cop that I wrestled with one time? But nothing was sticking. The guy's face just didn't ring a single bell. The guy said he wasn't all that surprised that I didn't remember him, and he says, "It's been a long time. You were just a kid when we last met." And I fell back on my training and tried turning a not-so-nice conversation into a nice one, saying something like, "Well, No wonder I don't remember you. I barely remember what I ate for dinner 2 nights ago. But the guy didn't laugh. He kept on smiling, but he didn't laugh. Then he asked me, and I had to look this up to make sure that I'm spelling it right, but he asked me, "Do you know what degenerative myopathy is, Craig?" You know when you've never heard of something before, like something sciencey, and you hear the words and you're just sort of like, huh? I mean, you probably just did it reading what I copied and pasted into this email here. Thought, degenomyo what now? Well, I hope you didn't go looking it up or anything, because I'm about to explain what it is, which is exactly what the weird guy with the burn scar did with me. And I told him, no, I don't. And then, in so many words, this is what he told me. Degenerative myopathy is a degenerative disease that affects German Shepherds, where their back legs start to weaken and eventually give out. It comes from a tiny defect in their DNA, and when the defect is present, the nerves in a dog's lower spine start to break down over time. The condition usually shows up when the German Shepherd is older, around 8 years or more, and at first, you might notice the dog dragging its back paws a little or wobbling when it walks. It's like their back legs are forgetting how to work properly, and then over months or even a couple of years, the weakness gets worse. The dog might struggle to stand up, have trouble walking, or eventually lose the ability to move its back legs altogether. It's tough to watch because the dog is still alert and happy in their mind, but their body just won't cooperate. Now he's giving me this weird speech, and then when he got to the sad part there about them still being all happy in their minds, I had to interrupt him. And I remember saying very politely, "Sir, I don't understand why you're telling me this." And he just raised a hand and then kept going. There's no cure for degenerative myopathy yet. Vets can suggest things like physical therapy, special harnesses, even wheelchairs to help a dog stay mobile and comfortable for as long as possible. The goal is to keep them happy and enjoying life even as their legs give out. And for now, researchers are working hard to learn more, but the best we can do is give these dogs lots of love and support to keep their tails wagging. And I remember in that moment thinking, is this guy working for some kind of charity or representing a drug or something? And so I asked him, but he said no. He told me he had a dog like that once, a German Shepherd that was the most loyal and beautiful dog he'd ever owned. He got her from a rescue after some cops raided a puppy mill, the kind of place where they don't take any care in the breeding of the dogs. They just churn out puppies for profit. He was told by people at the rescue that she'd probably have the DM defect. Some of the older dogs at the mill were showing advanced symptoms, so they figured it'd been passed on to a lot of the pups. And they were right. And when his loyal old dog reached 8 years old, he said, her back legs started to give out. Most of the time, a vet recommends putting the dog down once its quality of life gets too rough. German Shepherds are energetic dogs and they need to run and play and exercise just like any other. When they can't get all that, they get depressed, and when they get depressed, it makes the symptoms of the diseases all the worse. He started telling me how they lie there in the night, crying out because they can't make it to the bathroom, and then I interrupted him again, having dropped all the professional courtesy. I just say, "Dude, if you don't need my help, I'm probably gonna get security. I got a lot to get done today," and the guy opened his jacket, very discreetly showing off the gun that he had holstered near his armpit, and then softly said, "If you move a muscle, I'll kill you, and I'll kill everyone in this whole store before I eat this gun. I don't care." And I just froze. The guy went from a weird but gentle old guy to threatening me with this psychopathic look in his eyes, and then told me to shut up and listen, and then just went about talking about his dog. He said he didn't have the heart to have her put down, how the dog had saved his life during a messy divorce where he lost all custody of his kids. He said he'd resigned himself to taking care of a disabled dog until it died, or he did. And then came the fire. He was driving home from the grocery store, having only left his dog alone for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And then when he turned on his street, he saw the black smoke rising into the air. He said he just knew from the position of it, after having lived there for all those years, that it was his house that was going up in smoke. so he put his foot down on the gas, skidded into his driveway, then ran into his burning home to try and save his dog. He burned his hand checking a metal doorknob to see if it was warm. It wasn't just warm, it fried his skin and took a whole layer off. He used his shirt to open the door and his dog was laying on the other side. That dog was a smart old pooch, and when she was able, she used to be able to open up doors by standing on her hind legs and scrabbling at the handle. She could do it with round ones too, and it got to be a real problem sometimes. He'd have to put a chair up against the door to stop her wandering out into the backyard at night to bark at squirrels. And he kind of laughed as he talked, like he was recalling these nice memories. But I knew by then that he wasn't some kindly old man, at least not anymore. He said he tried to save his dog's life, but it was too late. She'd inhaled too much smoke and she'd passed on. The fire department arrived not long after, put out the blaze, then after investigating its causes, they told the guy it was arson. The cops had their suspicions as to who did it, but they could never prove it, so no one ever got punished for it. The house was burned so badly that it would have cost him way too much to repair, so he sold the land to developers, moved elsewhere, and tried to let go. But he couldn't. He planned on getting a new dog, but the thought of going through all that heartbreak again was something he couldn't face. Then, without a dog and only his failing business to keep him going, he found that he didn't have much to live for anymore. The only thing that kept him going was the thought of finding out who'd set his house on fire. And then after a long search, where for years he didn't get anywhere, he made a breakthrough. He found out that there were some kids in the area around that time. Some pretty bad ones, too. They liked drinking, smoking, and listening to heavy metal music. But whenever they got their spirits up, they liked one thing more than anything: to go out breaking, stealing, and, most relevant here, burning stuff. The sinking feeling that I felt when he said that last part is something that'll be with me till the day I die. I'd never felt anything like it before, not even when we found out our buddy was headed to juvie for something he didn't even do. And I've never felt anything like it since. It was like the single biggest, oh please God, no, moment of my whole godforsaken life, and it wasn't over, not by a long shot. I know it must have registered on my face, that feeling of dread I mean, because I remember seeing a female coworker of mine over the old man's shoulder and she looked pretty anxious. I guess the old man saw me looking because he looked over his shoulder. Then when he saw my female coworker walking towards us, he whispered, "I'll kill her. You just watch. Say anything, and I'll kill her." The same female coworker was one of the people I'd be joking with about how the guy had a crush on me. I guess she came by to silently laugh at first, then when she saw my face, she realized something was terribly wrong. She walked right up to me and the old guy and asked if everything was all right. I told her everything was fine, and that I was just helping the older gentleman make a purchase. He gave her this warm, convincing smile, told her I was being more than helpful, then declined her offer of more help. She gave me this kind of confused look, then was sort of like, "Well, okay then," and then walked off. But I could tell that she was going straight to security. We took care of each other that way, which was part of the reason I liked working there to begin with. I guess the older guy knew that he had to act, that people were catching on to him because he told me, "We're gonna walk out of the store together, and you're gonna walk with me to my truck. Try to run. I'll blow your kneecap out, then make you watch while I kill everyone I see." I actually didn't remember setting this guy's house on fire. I know that there's people that won't believe that, but it's true. I do think one of the buddies set the fire during a time when I wasn't hanging out with him, and I admit that's exactly the kind of thing we used to do back then, but I don't have this sort of photographic memory of setting a fire before running off. I told the guy that, how I thought that he had the wrong guy, but then the way he looked at me let me know that he was incredibly serious about everything he was saying, and I could see it, clear as day, how bad he wanted to just pull that gun out and turn my head into a canoe. But he held back, and so did I, raising my hands with palms flat as if to say, "Please don't." He swallowed, like he was swallowing down his rage, and then told me, "Walk ahead of me. Don't stop until I tell you to." I started walking, and just as I did, I saw security appear at the end of the aisle. I told them everything was fine as I walked past, Then they turned their attention to the old man, who told them, "It's all right, gentlemen. I was just leaving." And both guys backed off, gave each other a look, then the older man nodded to me and I kept on walking. I could feel the cold sweat on my back and in my armpits as I walked towards the store's front exit. It was like everything in me was screaming at me to not walk out those doors, because when I did, the guy was going to shoot me and then just walk to his truck and drive off. Or worse, he was going to force me to his truck, drive me someplace, and then do even worse things to me before the end. But when he said he'd sooner shoot up the store than allow me to run, and since I believed him when he said that, I knew that I had no choice but to just keep walking out the store and hope it was just me that he hurt and not everyone in sight. On the way out, another coworker asked where I was going. I told him I was taking 5, and since we didn't do stuff like that without permission from supervisors, he knew something was strange. But I don't think that he'd have been able to guess what it was if you gave him a million tries. And by the time we were walking through the parking lot, among the rows of hundreds of parked cars, the guy was jamming the barrel of his gun into my back, saying, "Don't stop now, or I'll put a dozen in the ground before I blow your head off." And I mean it when I say that's what kept me going. That and the feeling that my luck had finally run out, and it was time to pay the piper for the crap that I'd done when I was a teenager. He told me to get in his passenger seat, and so I did, and then he walked around to the driver's side and then climbed in next to me. I asked him where he was taking me, but he just told me, nowhere. He then took a pack of smokes off the dash, put one between his lips, and then pushed the top of the old-style cigarette lighter in his center console. While he waited for it to heat up, he started telling me how he thought about killing me for the longest time. Once he figured out who had set his house on fire and who had killed his dog, he thought about all the different ways that he could get revenge. Be it torture us, suffocate us, or set us on fire. But all that was too elaborate, too risky, and too time-consuming. Instead, he thought of something simple but effective, something that could do everything he wanted to do, that'd take no more time than a few minutes. He had the gun on me the whole time, and I didn't trust that he wasn't going to shoot me. I figured he was just saying all of that to keep my guard down so I wouldn't run, and he'd get to watch my face as he pulled the trigger. But he was telling the truth. He didn't shoot me. He did something else instead. When the cigarette lighter was done heating up, it popped back out with this little click. The guy then grabbed it, lit a cigarette with it, and then told me, "Don't move. You scream, but you don't dare move." And that's when he started leaning toward me, gun in one hand, glowing hot lighter in the other, and I realized what he was going to do. I gripped the door handle, not the opener, but the other plastic handle side, and all I remember before the pain hit is begging him, "Not my eye. Please, not my eye." He told me to shut up, thrust the lighter forward, then all I remember is searing pain burning through my face and screaming at the top of my lungs as I heard my own skin sizzling. He didn't just keep it in one place either. He dragged the metal across the cheek until I was clawing at the opener and falling out onto the blacktop below. I was whimpering, wanting to cover my face but not wanting to touch it either, and then as I looked up, the guy was already starting his car. I thought he was about to back up and drive over me, so I scrambled out of the way. But he just reversed, turned a little, and then took off so fast his open passenger door slammed shut as he moved. People were running over to me after hearing all the commotion, and I'll never forget how someone took one look at my face before a look of shock came over theirs. And then the way they shouted someone call 911, I knew that it was bad. The ambulance was there pretty quick. I thought about trying to drive myself to the hospital, but one of my coworkers told me to just get into the ambulance because it wasn't worth getting into an accident on the drive there. And when I arrived at the ER, nurses led me to a curtained-off area and asked me how it happened and how long ago. I answered as best I could, but I was still in so much shock and pain that it all came out kind of garbled. Next came the doctor, who after examining my face told me it was a 3rd-degree burn, and a bad one. She said the nerves were destroyed, which was why there was this weird numbness around the blackened crater that used to be a piece of my cheek. But the skin surrounding the burn was screaming with pain. The doctor also warned me that a combo of the burn's depth and where it was on my face meant that there was a big risk of infection and scarring. But at the time, I didn't care. All I wanted was for them to take the pain away, and the rest I could think about later. They put something on my face that made it hurt, but the next thing the nurses applied was sort of a cooling gel, and that's when I started to feel some relief. They also put some kind of antibiotic cream on my cheek and then put a dressing on it too. And before I was released, the doctor told me to avoid sunlight, not to touch the wound and just keep everything sterile, and then to come see a reconstructive specialist in a few days. They scheduled a follow-up, handed me a bag of medical stuff, and then sent me home with my face wrapped in bandages. And that first week was a nightmare. Work said to take as much time off as I needed, and they assured me that they'd be working with the cops as they tried to track this guy down. But the wound was bad, really bad. And when I first peeled back the dressing on my face, I saw this oozing circle. I avoided mirrors, but there was no escaping it because sometimes, even through the dressing, I could smell that infection was actually setting in. Antibiotics did keep it at bay, but that was a rough couple of days when I thought that it might actually take. And I followed the care routine obsessively, washing my hands over and over before I changed the dressings and applied the ointments. Sleep was almost impossible. I'd lie propped up on pillows to avoid the pressure on the wound, but the pain kept me awake. The painkillers dulled the worst of it, but I hated how they left me feeling like a zombie in the daytime. A few days later, I went to the reconstructive specialist's office and was told the dead tissue had to be surgically removed under local anesthesia. And that sucked hard, not just because of how gruesome it was, but because I got to hear all about how the burn was so deep that I needed a skin graft. In the meantime, I was given a kind of gel to help reduce the scarring, but I was told that it would still be very noticeable, even in the best possible scenarios. After the graft, where skin from my thigh was stitched onto my cheek, the site remained swollen and discolored, leaving a raised, lumpy scar that tugged painfully when I spoke or smiled. After 6 months, the scar was a thick circle, pale and shiny with jagged edges where the red-hot metal had burned deepest. It distorted my cheek, pulling the skin taut and slightly misaligning my lower eyelid. Makeup couldn't conceal it. The texture was too uneven, the color too stark, and in some lights it looked kind of like a brand. And I guess that was exactly the intention. Something I could never stop seeing, that'd remind me of who I was and what I'd done. But more than anything, it reminded me of how scared I felt walking out to that guy's car, as well as the pain I felt before I finally found it in myself to grab the door handle and tumble out onto the road. Speaking of the guy's car, the cops eventually found it burned out on a dirt road a few days later. They said that there was evidence that he transferred into another vehicle, but since there were no cameras of any of the back roads, there was very little chance that they'd find out what his second ride had been. All they had was the security camera footage from the store, but there was no matching the guy's face up to any known suspect. He just walked me outside, scarred me for life, driven off to a second vehicle, and then dropped off the face of the earth. But do you want to know something? Not once have I thought about going looking for this guy, because I believe we did do what he accused us of. I do think that we killed his dog, and if that is true, well, what I got was generous and merciful given the circumstances. Sometimes I stare at it and think about how much worse it could have been. The specialist says laser treatments or further surgeries might make it look a little less obvious, but I know deep down that the damage is too deep. For now, I live with it. A reminder of that day and what I used to be. I apply my sunscreen, but less for the actual protection and more as a way of trying to reclaim some control over what's now the most eye-catching and obvious aspect of my physical appearance. And like I said, I'm not ugly or anything, not by any standard, but I sure do have an unusual face. I'm a park ranger, and in 2017 I was stationed at Kings Canyon National Park. I bunked at the Grant Grove cabins along with my coworker Tom, who was in a separate cabin nearby. One night after a long day of patrols, I was ready for bed and had just changed into my sleep clothes when I heard voices coming from outside my cabin. I listened as the voices grew louder as they got closer, but they didn't sound calm or casual. They sounded scared, high-pitched, and desperate. Seconds later, I heard a frantic knocking on my cabin door. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled on my boots, still in my sweatpants and t-shirt as I opened the door. Now in front of me were two young women, looking pale and scared. One had a jacket tied around her shoulder, and I could see blood soaking through it. She clutched her arm, wincing as her breath came through, and gasped. I didn't need to ask what was wrong, as it was clear that something terrible had just happened. I brought them inside and turned on the cabin's light. The woman with the bloody jacket collapsed onto the floor and her friend kneeled beside her. I asked to see the wound on her shoulder, and when I did, my stomach started tying itself into knots. It looked like a bite wound, a deep one, but it wasn't shaped like some animal. When I asked them what the hell happened, one of the girls said that they'd heard someone walking behind them along the path, and then when they turned to see who it was, a naked man started running at them, tackled one of them, then sank his teeth directly into her shoulder. And he didn't let go until one of the girls kicked him right in the balls. But after rolling around in pain for a minute, the guy got up and started chasing them again. I grabbed my radio and called Tom, telling him to come over, and he was there in minutes, and he had the same reaction I did when he saw that bite pattern. I told Tom to stay with the girls and keep them safe. If whoever did that came back, he needed to protect them. I grabbed my duty belt, clipped my holster, and checked my pistol, and I then put on my ranger jacket and stepped outside into the night. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew those women needed our help, and all of that stuff in that moment was absolutely insane, but my mind was clear. I moved slowly through the woods. My flashlight was trying to cut through the darkness as I scanned the spaces between the trees. I had my pistol at my hand, and the safety was off, but I kept it low as I forced myself to try and breathe steady. I'd been trained for situations like this, though I'd never faced one quite so insane. A nude man was chasing women, and he'd bit one of them. None of it made any sense, but still, here I was, and I had to find him. I followed a trail near the cabins, one that led toward a meadow that the girls had ran through. Since they both come from that direction, I figured their attacker might still be out in that area. Everything in the forest was quiet. I didn't hear any voices or footsteps, and I stopped every few seconds to listen out as my flashlight was sweeping. And then I heard it. A rustle, like someone moving fast through the underbrush. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just branches swaying. I stepped forward. My grip was tightening on my pistol as I heard another noise to my left, closer that time. I turned and my light caught something pale moving between the trees. It was him. Those girls were correct. And he didn't have any clothing on him. And now he was running. Not towards me, but parallel, like he was almost circling me. I shouted for him to stop, but he didn't. I then tried my best to keep my light on him, but he was really fast. My flashlight bounced as I chased him, which was very disorienting. I lost sight of him for a moment, and then I saw him again, much closer than before. I called out again, ordering him to stop, and I remember how he turned with this wild look in his eyes. And before I could react, he rushed me. And my God, was he fast. A split second later, his body slammed into mine and we both hit the ground. My flashlight was knocked out of my hand as his hands grabbed at me. I felt his breath on my face as I felt how terrifyingly strong he was. I was panicking, but I fought against it. My pistol was still in my hand. I twisted my body up, trying to free up some space for myself, but he was heavy, pinning me down with his fingers digging into my arms. Finally, I managed to pull my arm free, and the first chance I got, I fired. The shot was loud, and his body jerked the second I pulled the trigger. A groan suddenly escaped him, and I felt his grip loosen. I pushed him off and then scrambled to my feet. Then I grabbed my flashlight and pointed at him along with my gun. He was on the ground, clutching at his stomach, groaning in pain, but I felt exactly zero sympathy for him. If he died, so be it, because it'd either be him or me, I thought in that moment. I kept my pistol on him, but my hands were shaking. He wasn't moving much. He was just curled up and groaning in pain, and he didn't seem like a threat to me, but I still didn't take any chances. I radioed for help, telling dispatch where I was and what had happened, and after that I cuffed the guy, careful not to touch his blood. He didn't fight. He was just laying there, still groaning in pain. And I just stayed put, my light and gun still on him until help eventually arrived. Other rangers and paramedics came quickly. They took him away on a stretcher while the woman with the bite wound got it treated and cleaned and bandaged. She obviously needed stitches, a lot of them too, and maybe even a rabies shot or something if the situation was really that bad. But they were safe. I went back to my cabin after it was all over. My hands were still trembling as I washed the dirt off my face, and I remember tossing my sweatpants into the trash because there was a big rip down the seat of them. Then I just sat on my bed staring at the wall, trying to process what the hell just happened, all while the forest outside went quiet again, like nothing had even happened. The man survived the gunshot. He later went to prison, charged with aggravated assault, and the women sent a letter addressed to me and Tom thanking us for saving them that day. The eventual toxicology report came back saying that that guy was on a cocktail of an insane amount of crap. Obviously so. Who would do something so insane if not? But I kept that letter in my desk, though I don't read it as often as I used to. Half of a ranger's job is about protecting people, but that night tested me in a way I'd never expected. I'm glad I was there, glad I could help, but I also hope that I never have to face anything that insane ever again. Just after midnight on August 3rd of 2019, a 21-year-old Texan man departed the home of his grandparents in the Dallas suburb of Allen and climbed into his car. Over the next 2 hours, he drove approximately 660 miles west, stopping twice at service stations hundreds of miles apart. During his stops, he bought gas and energy drinks, caffeinating to remain focused during the long drive ahead. By the time the sun had risen high in the skies behind him, the man had reached El Paso, the Texan border town that straddles the international divide with its conjoined Mexican twin, the Ciudad Juarez. Yet instead of heading to a specific destination, he began driving around the east side of El Paso, cruising the streets for almost an hour with seemingly no purpose whatsoever. Just before 9 a.m., the man spotted a branch of Walmart opposite Cielo Vista Mall, and after parking his car in the store's lot, he walked inside and began wandering the aisles. After maybe 20 to 30 minutes of slowly ambling around the store, the man noticed a loss prevention associate watching him from a distance. As if embarrassed at the assumption that he was a shoplifter, the rather awkward 21-year-old headed for the fresh produce section, picked up an orange and then purchased it at the checkouts before heading for an exit. He then stood outside the store, eating his orange before wiping his hand on his shirt and walking back to his car. For the next 20 to 30 minutes, the man sat in his driver's seat thinking about his family, his future, and his freedom. And he suddenly grabbed a laptop from his back seat and booted up the device. Then, at exactly 10:15 a.m., he posted a thread to the website 8chan simply titled, "It's Time." 5 minutes later, the man uploaded a PDF document to the same thread, entitled The Inconvenient Truth. 8chan's moderators quickly removed the document, but fast-fingered users were able to copy and share its contents with alarming efficiency. Moderators began to panic, and not just because control of their own website was slipping through their fingers. They were panicking because the document's contents contained a bile-filled diatribe of far-right conspiracies, as well as a call to violence that was as urgent as it was chilling. Site moderators rushed to inform the authorities, but it was too late, and try as they might, what was coming could not be stopped. Back in the Walmart parking lot, now baking in the mid-morning sun, the 21-year-old climbed out of his car, then took something from his trunk. He strapped it to his body, tightening strips of nylon by yanking them through plastic slings. Then once he was done, he began walking toward the Walmart. Standing outside were a group of fundraisers from the all-female El Paso Fusion soccer team who cheerfully solicited donations from passers-by. Nearby, a woman slowly pushed a shopping cart toward the store. The 21-year-old spotted her, raised a semi-automatic Romanian-made version of an AKM rifle, then fired the first shot of what would become a massacre. This is where the man becomes the shooter. After executing the woman pushing her shopping cart with a single calmly placed shot, the shooter turned the rifle on the fundraisers and opened fire. The move took him no longer than a fraction of a second, giving the fundraisers no time to react. Then as they turned to flee, bullet after bullet tore through their bodies as the shooter methodically aimed and fired over and over until all lay still. The store's manager, who witnessed the shooter engaging the fleeing fundraisers, immediately issued a Code Brown to his employees. Code Brown is Walmart's designated code word for an active shooter, and employees are trained to help hide or evacuate vulnerable customers. Many fled through emergency exits to adjacent stores, others concealed themselves in shipping containers or under tables. But for many, as the shooter entered a store containing hundreds of terrified customers, there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. At exactly 10:39 a.m., and having spotted an armed man walking through the store's glass entryway, an elderly gentleman tried running. But unfortunately, he simply was not fast enough to evade his killer's gaze. The shooter put a bullet in him, then turned his attention towards several people near the checkout area who appeared frozen with fear. He gunned each of them down, coldly and methodically, before doing the same to those sheltered in a branch of the First Convenience Bank. After walking his way through the store, killing as he went, the shooter reached the Walmart's eastern exit, then wandered out of the building at exactly 10:42 a.m., just 3 minutes after he first entered. Upon re-entering the store's parking lot, the shooter spotted a married couple running for cover behind their car. He opened fire on them, hitting both. Then bizarrely, he simply stopped shooting. With hundreds of people still running around the lot in blind panic, the shooter returned to his vehicle. He calmly drove to the intersection of Sunmount and Viscount, whereupon he spotted a Texas Ranger talking with an El Paso motorcycle officer, no doubt regarding the terrible events that had just unfolded. The two law enforcers watched in confusion as the shooter pulled over in the left turn lane, then climbed out of his car with his hands raised in the air. On his approach, he told them he'd just shot up the Walmart opposite Cielo Vista Mall. The officers then asked the man's name, and this is where the shooter becomes Patrick Wood Crusius. Crusius was born July 27, 1998. He was a child of divorce, with his parents having separated when he was just 3 years old, and by his teenage years, he was living with his grandparents in the Dallas suburb of Allen. He attended Beverly Elementary School in Plano, where a former classmate, Daniel Hill, described him as a nice kid who played basketball and soccer during recess. But by the time Crusius graduated Plano Senior High School in 2017, his demeanor had shifted completely. One former high school classmate, Jacob Wilson, described Crusius as introverted, irritable, and strong-minded, often refusing to collaborate with others due to his temperament. Wilson noted that Crusius was frequently bullied for his speech, clothing, and aloof demeanor, which led to social isolation. Another acquaintance who walked to school with Crusius recalled him having an unsettling fascination with snakes. And following his arrest, Crusius waived his Miranda rights, confessing directly to detectives that not only was he the shooter, but he had deliberately targeted Latino Americans during the attack. He also confessed to the online purchase of a WASR-10 semi-automatic rifle and 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition online in June 2019. When asked why he'd committed such a hideous attack on unarmed people, Crusius directed detectives to the manifesto he'd posted just minutes before the first shot was fired, titled The Inconvenient Truth. The post included Crusius's name, as well as information on the weapon he planned to use in his attack. He also claimed to be inspired by the Christchurch mosque shootings, which killed 51 people in New Zealand just a few months prior. Creepiest expressed a passionate approval for the murders, as well as a disdain for environmental degradation, cultural and ethnic replacement, and what he referred to as a Hispanic invasion. While primarily focused on ethnic and racial grievances, the document also expresses fears of automation's effects on employment and blames corporations for overusing natural resources. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, media outlets described the attack as the single deadliest instance of anti-Latino violence in U.S. history. 20 innocent people perished at the scene. 3 more would pass away as a result of their injuries in the following months and years. 13 victims were taken to the University Medical Center of El Paso, and another 11 to the Del Sol Medical Center. 2 children, ages 2 and 9 years old, were transferred to El Paso Children's Hospital, where thankfully their conditions were stabilized. Later that day, President Donald Trump condemned the shooting as a hateful act of cowardice and promised to provide total support to the city of El Paso and its first responders. The president also announced that all U.S. flags, both foreign and domestic, will be flown at half-mast until sunset on August 8th. In a speech from the White House 2 days after the shooting, the president stated that, in one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. On February 6th of the year 2020, Patrick Creepiest was charged with 22 counts of committing a hate crime resulting in death and 22 counts of use of a firearm to commit murder. He quickly waived his federal bond hearing during his first federal court appearance, and just a few months later, entered a plea of not guilty to federal charges. It became clear that Creepiest's attorney were attempting an insanity defense, as when the subject of the death penalty arose, they began demonstrating Patrick's history of severe mental disabilities. His attorneys went on to state that Patrick was being treated with powerful antipsychotic medication, and that at the time of his arrest, he was in a, quote, state of psychosis. The evidence for Patrick's mental illness was so compelling that in January of 2023, prosecutors announced that they would not be seeking the death penalty. But it seems this might also have been down to a sudden change of heart, because just a few weeks later, Patrick Creepiest pleaded guilty to a grand total of 90 hate crimes and murder charges. Prior to his sentencing, the judge asked Patrick if he felt any remorse. After meekly nodding his head, he was sentenced to 90 consecutive life sentences, and in the state of Texas, if each life sentence is treated as a minimum of 40 years, 90 consecutive sentences would equate to exactly 3,600 years of incarceration. In the months that followed what Senator Ted Cruz called an unspeakable evil, there was an outpouring of tributes to the city and citizenry of El Paso. In one instance, Antonio Basco declared that the funeral of his 63-year-old wife Margie would be open to anyone who wished to attend. Then on the day, hundreds of people from all over the United States arrived to pay their respects, while the funeral home was inundated with bouquets of flowers sent from every corner of the globe. 1 week after the shooting, a Mexican man named Jorge Chavez ran a total of 22 miles, one for each of the people killed in the shooting, starting at the Zaragoza Bridge in Juarez, Mexico, and finishing at the Walmart Memorial in El Paso, where the attack was perpetrated. In addition, the El Paso Healing Garden at Ascaret Park was dedicated in August of 2021, which was later designated a national memorial in December of 2022. During such terrible and trying times, many seek comfort and reassurance in all kinds of music, art, film, and literature. But in this case, I believe it is William Carlos Williams' poem, The Second Coming, that says it best. The world is too much with us, and we are with it. The violence, the hatred, the turning in the widening gyre. But there is a second coming, not of despair, but of the small acts, the hands that reach, the voices that sing against the dark. as long as I can remember, I've always had a passion for the outdoors. Growing up in Minnesota, my dad introduced me to hiking, camping, fishing, and hunting at a very early age, and would often take me on trips to Grand Portage, Pipestone, and St. Croix. But it wasn't until we visited Voyageurs National Park when I was 9 years old that I got my first good look at a U.S. park ranger. We were at a dock at the lake when suddenly, there he was, walking toward us in his starched dark green uniform and his wide-brimmed Smokey Bear hat. He had this shiny ranger's badge on his chest, and his shirt had these cool shoulder epaulets, and his utility belt was loaded up with tools for taming the wilderness. He looked ready for anything, like he could wrestle a bear one minute and then guide us through a storm the next. And when I was a kid, I was in awe. He and my dad exchanged a few words, and I hung on to every single one, picturing myself in that same uniform as I walked trails, steered boats, and rescued lost hikers. That ranger was the coolest person I'd ever seen, and the second I laid eyes on him, I thought, that's what I want to be when I grow up. The kind of ranger who knew every tree, every animal, and could make the vast, untamed wilderness feel just like home. And from that day forward, I'm not kidding, I was obsessed. I started collecting park brochures and begging my dad to have us stop by the ranger station anytime we visited a park or forest, just so I could say hi and check the place out. And that's how I got myself my very own Smokey Bear hat, and there's a photograph of me wearing it at my 11th birthday party. I looked silly with some oversized hat on my head, but I didn't care. I was the happiest kid in the world, having everyone seeing me wearing it. Since I needed a degree, I figured a good one might be environmental science, but it was volunteer seasonal work that really gave me the leg up when it came to getting hired. Working as things like park guides and visitors assistants taught me practical skills in things like trail maintenance and water safety, so when it came to the National Park Service's ultra-competitive hiring process, I could tailor my resume to stand out from the crowd. The NPS sent me over a questionnaire which allowed me to further showcase my knowledge of park operations, and then after acing that interview, the background checks, and the physical fitness test, I finally got the call saying that I'd been accepted. It was a lifelong dream come true. I was finally a U.S. park ranger, and my first posting was none other than the Voyageurs National Park, the very same place that I'd first laid eyes on that ranger all those years before. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. About 6 months in, we had a kid almost drown after he fell in X Bay. Then we had an older hiker go missing for a few days in the fall of 1997, which gave her family and us a real scare. But then in the late summer of 1998, my fellow rangers and I went through something that none of us have ever forgotten, and that we've never been fully able to explain. It was early afternoon, and I was out on patrol near Black Bay, walking a trail that I'd walked 100 times before. I was mostly checking for signs of illegal campsites because illegal campsites usually meant poachers, but it had been a quiet and uneventful morning and I hadn't found any. Just past noon, I made my way toward a loop that'd take me back towards my ranger station. Then, as I was maybe only a quarter of a mile out, a noise came through the trees that instantly caught my attention as something that didn't belong. I used to hear all kinds of things walking those woods, but this wasn't the rustle of a deer or the snap of a branch under a bear's paw. It was a low, croaky, but very human-sounding groan, like someone was in a hell of a lot of pain. I stopped dead, my hand going for my radio, because if someone was as badly hurt as they sounded, I needed to call it in, and quick. I yelled out, asking if anyone was there. There was silence for a second, and then I heard the groan again, closer that time. I moved toward it, stepping off the trail into the underbrush as I scanned the area ahead for movement. And then I saw it. I saw him. He staggered out from behind a cluster of trees, maybe 30 yards ahead of me. A man, or at least what was left of one. His clothes were shredded and were hanging from his body like rags. His skin was just this complete mess of blood and burns, blackened in some places, raw and red in others, while his face looked painful and swollen, with one eye half shut and the other wide open and bloodshot. He was wheezing and stumbling forward, then when he saw me, he let out a sound that was kind of like a half sob and half yelp. He begged me to help him, but I'm ashamed to say that for the first split second or so after I saw him, I froze. I think my brain was trying to process what I was seeing. I had seen all sorts of injuries before. Hikers with broken legs, hunters who'd gone and shot themselves by accident. But this was different. The guy looked like he'd been roasted alive. I snapped out of it and ran to him just as he collapsed to the ground. His skin looked slick with blood and sweat, and he smelled like charred meat. And I knew not to touch him or try to move him, so I got on my radio and called in for help, and then tried to verbally reassure the man that help was on the way. But by then, his breathing was coming in these short, ragged gasps, and before he passed out, he muttered something about fire and how he wasn't supposed to be there. But I didn't have time to think about any of that. My only goal was getting him the help that he desperately needed. One of my fellow rangers arrived just minutes later riding an ATV with a skid attached. A skid being a kind of wheeled gurney that you can attach to the back of an ATV. We moved our burn victim slow, and I kept talking to him and telling him to hang on, but he was already fading fast. The station was a small log building, just a couple of rooms with a radio, a first aid kit, and some basic supplies. 2 other rangers, Tom and Ellen, were there waiting for us when we arrived. Ellen's face went pale. Tom cursed under his breath and ran over to help. Tom ripped open the first aid kit, pulling out gauze, saline, anything I could use, while Ellen ran to the radio and called for an air ambulance. We did what we could for him and tried to keep him stable, but it wasn't enough. He was in agony, thrashing weakly on the table with his voice nothing more than a low, broken whimper. The guy's injuries were even worse than I'd thought. His arms were charred black in places, the skin cracked and oozing, and his chest was just cuts and burns like he'd been dragged through something sharp and hot. And I kept wondering where the hell he'd come from. There'd been no reports of a fire, no smoke in the air, and no sign of a campsite gone wrong. But here he was, looking like he'd just been immolated. The air ambulance took 40 minutes to get there, and it was the longest 40 minutes of my life. We kept working on him, trying to keep him alive, but his breathing got shallower and his movements weaker, and we could see that he was slipping away. When the paramedics finally arrived, they took one look at our burned victim and got to work, loading him onto a stretcher and rushing him to the helicopter. Then I stood there, still in shock, watching the chopper lift off into the sky. We wouldn't find out until much later, but he died in the air, somewhere over the forest, and was gone by the time they got him to the hospital. The station was quiet after that. We just sat there staring at the black marks and wet spots left behind on the table, and none of us said much because there really wasn't much to say. We'd done everything we could, but it hadn't been enough. We tried to go back to work, but what happened that afternoon seemed to just hang over us. The way that he seemed to stagger out of the woods, and the way that he sounded. The other rangers talked about it in these hushed voices, speculating about who he was and what had happened. A hiker who'd maybe gotten lost, or a drifter who'd set himself on fire. Nobody really has any true answers. The woods can always be a very dangerous place, and people get hurt out there sometimes. At least that's what we like to tell ourselves. Now, a few weeks later, our superintendent, this guy named Bill, called me into his office. He told me he'd gotten a call from a trooper with the Minnesota State Patrol. They were trying to identify our burned victim, but they kept coming up empty. No direct DNA hits, no missing person reports lined up. The guy was a ghost, a John Doe with no past. There was one lead that the trooper had, but according to Bill, it was a strange one. The boots our burned victim was wearing were old, really old, like standard issue U.S. Park Ranger boots from 1947 old. And Bill showed me a photo that the trooper had sent. They were scuffed and worn, but the design was unmistakable. I'd seen pictures of those very same boots in old training manuals, the kind Rangers used to wear way back then. The trooper didn't think that the guy was a Ranger. Nobody stays in the service 40 years without getting a new pair of boots, but he figured that he'd call to check if we knew him, or maybe if he was someone who'd worked here long ago. I didn't have any answers, and none of us did. We'd already gone through the park's records looking for anything that might connect, but no former Rangers remained unaccounted for, and no one recognized what was left of the guy's face. The boots were the only clue, and even so, they raised more questions than they answered. Bill said the trooper sounded frustrated. They'd run every test they could and checked every database, but they'd come up empty at every turn, and the burns were just another dead end. No fire had been reported in the park, or anywhere nearby for that matter, and there were no charred campsites, no scorched trees, and it was like this guy had just been burned someplace else, driven out into the woods, and then thrown from a vehicle of some kind. The coroner couldn't even say what caused the burns. He didn't think that it was a campfire, and it definitely didn't seem to be just gasoline. It was clear that the guy had been exposed to something of intense heat, but he just couldn't say what that heat was clearly from. Now, this guy was buried in a county cemetery as just another John Doe, and the park moved on like it always does. Hikers kept coming, the seasons changed, and we just kept ourselves busy with our usual duties. But obviously I couldn't let it go. I started thinking about it too much, especially at night when I was alone in that cabin. I'd lie awake, listening to the wind in the trees, and then when I'd close my eyes, I'd see him all over again. That burned, bloodied man staggering toward me through the trees and begging for help. I'd wondered where he came from and how he got so badly burned, whether it was people that did it to him or something else, like a lightning strike or something. And I started to quietly ask questions. I didn't want the other rangers thinking that I was losing it, but let's just say that I had some theories. I talked to some of the old-timers, rangers who had been around the park since the 60s, and asked if they've ever heard of anything so weird or anything that didn't add up. Most of them just shrugged. They'd heard all kinds of stories over the years, stuff about missing hikers and strange lights or noises that didn't make sense, but nothing like our burn victim who came staggering through those trees. One guy, a retired ranger named Carl, told me something that stuck with me though. He said that the park had places where things didn't quite feel right. He'd never seen anything himself, but he'd heard stories from loggers and trappers, people who'd traveled through that area before the park was established. There were stories of people going missing or coming back different, like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. And I didn't really know what to make of that. Carl was a veteran ranger, a real no-nonsense kind of guy, so seeing him talk like that was quite something, and I started looking at the park in a new light. I'd find myself avoiding places I'd never thought twice about before, like the stretch of woods where I'd found our burn victim. It wasn't fear exactly, it was almost like his appearance felt like a warning, and it was one I was all ears to. Years went by, and I kept my thoughts to myself. But every day I thought about what happened to that poor guy, how scared he looked, how he died in agony. I left the service in 2018, then moved to a small house outside of Duluth. I thought leaving the park would help, that I'd finally let it go, but it seems to have followed me. I'd sit on my porch at night staring out into the dark, and I'd think about him, who he was, where did he come from, and what the hell left him all burned up like that. And I started doing my own research and digging into old records, anything I could find about voyagers or the land before it was a park, and I found nothing about a missing ranger and nothing about a fire that could explain the burns. But I did find other stories. As back in May of 2009, the homestead building of Death Valley's Barker Ranch just suddenly burst into flames one day. Coincidentally, Barker Ranch was the place Charlie Manson was found hiding back in the 60s after his followers went on their helter-skelter rampage, and the rangers over there at the DV National Park went to great lengths to keep the place in good shape. But then one day, the place burned down, and try as they might, but the rangers over there just couldn't figure it out. It couldn't have been a brush fire because, like I said, they kept the place from getting overgrown. Then on top of that, May isn't even nearly the hottest part of the year down there, and even when it is, things just don't burst into flames. I don't know what to believe, as I'm a former ranger and I deal in facts, but facts don't explain what I saw that day back in '98. They don't explain the boots or the burns or the way that the man looked at me like he was confused almost. I've tried to tell myself that it was just an accident, a hiker who tried to start a campfire and tragically set himself alight somehow. Or maybe he was building a meth lab, I don't know. But when I get to thinking about it, how we found no evidence of any campfire in that direct area, I start to wonder if something else did happen to him. Something we either can't explain, or we're not yet willing to face. I've been working as an overnight security guard at Walmart for about 3 years now, at this big old supercenter just off the highway near my hometown. It's definitely one of the better jobs I've worked, even with all the nights involved. The pay is decent, the benefits are okay, and most nights, it's just me and another guard chilling in the asset protection office, keeping an eye on the cameras and talking trash to keep each other awake. The store is closed from midnight to 6, so it tends to be nice and quiet on the inside. But outside, that parking lot's a whole different story. After a while, you get used to seeing things that make most folks' skin crawl. But this one night, about 6 months back, I saw what has to be the scariest thing I've ever seen on the job. I'm pretty seasoned by now, and by that I mean I'm not some rookie jumping at shadows, but I'm also not some kind of wannabe cop either. My job's to watch the store, make sure nobody's breaking in or setting the place on fire, then anything outside the store walls is for the cops to handle, unless it's a direct threat to the property. We've got cameras all over the place, inside and outside, and they're good enough to catch a shoplifter snagging a TV or some kids spray painting the loading dock. But out in the far reaches of the parking lot, forget it. It's all grainy blobs and shadows past a certain point. Now anyway, this night started out as normal. Quiet, pretty boring really. And then at around 2 a.m., I told my shift partner that I was headed out for a smoke break. I've been trying to quit for years, but those overnight shifts drive people to worse habits than smoking, and purely out of boredom too. My partner was back at the security desk, scrolling through his phone or watching reruns of Cops on YouTube, and I told him that I was stepping out for a smoke and then grabbed my jacket and headed for the emergency exit by the auto care center. I propped the door open with a brick, which is against policy, I know, but nobody's checking at that hour. And then I just stood outside, taking some drags and staring out into the night. The parking lot is massive, obviously, just like most Walmart parking lots are, I guess. And at 2 a.m., it's mostly empty except for a few employee cars and an RV or two. Sometimes we get drifters or tweakers, maybe kids racing their souped-up Civics, but most of the time, I don't pay them much mind. I'm a real live and let live kind of guy, you know. I'm not out here to try and be a hero or boss anyone around. I just want my smoke and then I want to go back and do my job. Now anyway, I'm halfway through my smoke break leaning against the wall when I notice these two cars out in the far corner of the lot less than 100 yards out. They're backed up to each other, trunk to trunk, very close-like, you know. One's a dark SUV, the other's a beat-up sedan, maybe a Camry or something. The SUV's got its trunk open and there's 3 guys standing around it. They're not being loud or anything, but the way they're positioned, huddled, glancing around every few seconds, it's obvious they're up to no good. I've seen deals go down before. Not a lot, but I've seen them. Usually it's quick. Money changes hands, trunks close, and then they peel out. I don't call the cops unless it's blatant, like if they're waving a pistol around or something. My rule is, if it's not on Walmart property and it's not a clear threat, I let it slide. The cops got better things to do, and so do I. So I'm watching these guys, keeping my distance, just kind of being snoopy, I guess. And 2 of them are standing by the open trunk, gesturing like they're showing something off, while the 3rd guy is standing a little closer to the sedan, kind of hanging back like he's making his mind up. They're all dressed up in hoodies and jeans, nothing too flashy, but I can't make out faces or license plates from where I'm at, and our cameras sure as hell wouldn't be able to either. I figured it's drugs, maybe grass, maybe something harder. It could just as easily be guns, but I don't see any obvious hardware. Not that I could from that distance that I was at, though. I'm not spooked, just curious, you know, like watching a nature documentary about shady parking lot creatures. But that's when things take a turn. The guy who was hanging back steps forward and then leans in to look at whatever's in the SUV's trunk. He's got his hands on his hips, very casual like he's inspecting something up close. And I'm thinking, all right, the deal's wrapping up, they're gonna be gone soon. But then, out of nowhere, one of the other guys pulls something from behind his back, a bag or something, maybe a pillowcase, I couldn't tell, and then he throws it over the 3rd guy's head. Before I can even process what's happening, the other SUV guy lunges forward and starts stabbing him. And I mean like turning him into a sieve, stabbing him, over and over, super quick, bang, 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 bang. The guy with his bag over his head doesn't even have time to scream. He just stumbles, struggles a little, and then he's down. out of sight as his buddies throw him in the trunk. And I'm just frozen for a split second, cigarette dangling between my fingers, thinking, oh God, help me. That was for real, wasn't it? And my heart's pounding like a jackhammer, and every instinct I've got is telling me to get the hell inside. So I dropped my smoke without stopping to stomp on it, and then bolted for the emergency exit. I'd left it propped open like always, and I'm not a small guy, but I was running like I'd just seen a ghost. And as I'm pulling the door shut behind me, I hear tires screeching, and then I catch a glimpse of the SUV speeding off, red taillights glowing as it disappeared into the dark. I locked the door, my hand shaking so bad that I could barely get the bolt to slide, and I remember cursing under my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Did I just witness a murder? A kidnapping? What the hell was that? And I sprint back to my security office where my partner was still parked at the desk, scrolling through his phone like it was just another Tuesday. And I yelled at him to call the cops, and he looked up at me like confused, wondering what's going on. I told him what I saw, how I was pretty certain I just witnessed a guy getting murdered, and his eyes went wide, and then he dialed 911 right away. And I remember pacing back and forth as he handed me his phone, trying to get my thoughts straight as I replayed everything in my head. And it all happened so fast, maybe 10 seconds from the bag going over the guy's head to the SUV peeling out. And I can still picture the way the guy's arm moved, that quick, jerky, stabby motion, like something right out of a horror movie. The cops showed up about 15 minutes later. I told them everything I saw, which honestly wasn't all that much. And there were 3 guys, 2 cars, 1 got stabbed a bunch, and then the SUV took off. I didn't see any faces, didn't catch any plate numbers, and I didn't hear any names either. They start asking me a million questions. What kind of bag was it? How many times did the guy get stabbed? Did I hear anything? Did I see any blood? But I had nothing for him. It was too far, too dark, and it all happened too quick. I felt kind of useless, like I should have seen more or done more. But then what was I supposed to do? Run out there with my flashlight and my walkie-talkie? We're not armed on shift, and they don't train us for anything like that either. I'm just a guy, making sure nobody steals anything or spray paints the walls. And after we talked, the cops seemed more interested in the security footage, so me and my partner pulled up the feeds from the exterior cameras. We've got a couple pointed at the parking lot, but like I said, they're not great. The cars were too far out, right at the edge of the lot where the lights barely reached them. All the footage showed were 2 blurry shapes and some movement, but you couldn't make out details, no faces or plates, really nothing useful at all. The cops were frustrated, but obviously not with us. They took a copy of the footage anyway and said they'd check the sedan that was still out there. After they left, my partner and I just sit there quiet for a while. He was all right, but I was pretty shaken up. I kept thinking about how fast it happened. 1 second the guy was alive, probably thinking that he was making a quick deal. Then the next, he's got a bag over his head and a knife in his gut, and it was all over and done in seconds. It was just crazy to me. How does that even happen? Who were those guys? Was it a setup, a betrayal, some kind of gang thing? Sometimes it frustrates me that I'll never know. And the cops never really followed up, at least not with me. And I checked the news for days, but there's really nothing. No reports or arrests. And I still work the overnight shift, but I don't smoke outside anymore. I use those Zyn things now, those little pouches, and I stay in the break room if I need a fix. But every time I walk by that emergency exit, I'm reminded of what happened that night and how I watched it all go down. I've seen a lot in this job. Fights, thefts, you name it, and they're forgotten a week after. But what happened that night is something I know I'll never forget. Back in the day, I had this buddy named Mike. We used to drink at the same bar. Then after we got talking following a game one night, we became regular drinking partners. And Mike turned out to be a pretty solid guy. The kind that you could count on to have your back in an emergency. We'd talk about all kinds of things whenever we'd shoot the breeze over a few beers. You know the stuff. Sports, work, women, news. But after a while, I realized there was this one thing about Mike that I didn't know much about: his past. I knew that he grew up in the Southwest, and I knew that he moved over to New Mexico for a while, but it hit me that I had no idea why he moved or what he did down there. It turns out he used to be a park ranger out in the desert someplace, but then, instead of talking about the job or telling me a few stories, Mike says to me, I don't really like talking about it. I didn't ask any more questions. I can't say that I was curious, but I figured that he'd talk about it when he was good and ready. We were living up near Sault Ste. Marie at the time, right next to the Canadian border, so the fact that Mike had moved across the country got me thinking. He's had all that nice dry weather down there in the south, and for some reason he'd traded it for some cold gray corner of Michigan. It was just weird, and I couldn't stop myself wondering why. But like I said, I didn't press him on it. One night, we were at our usual spot, a bar called Rusty's, where the bar top was always sticky and the jukebox only played Springsteen and Seeger. It was getting late, and I guess I had a few too many beers because I remember my curiosity suddenly getting the better of me, and I started asking Mike about his ranger days. And his face changed. Then after a second, he said he was posted someplace dry and sandy, and then went quiet. I kept asking questions, like what the job was like and why he quit, but he shut me down quick. He said he didn't want to talk about it, and I felt this swell of regret rise in my chest. His voice wasn't mean, just firm, and I got the message. And I dropped it and never brought it up again. Now years passed, and Mike and I stayed buddies. We graduated to going to fishing on the weekends and then catching games when we could afford the tickets. He never talked about his ranger days, and I kept my word about never asking. But then one night, out of the blue, I guess he just changed his mind. We were at my place, sitting on the back porch with a couple of drinks, when Mike leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and asked if I wanted to hear a ghost story. He sounded serious, but from the way he said it, I figured he was about to tell me some kind of campfire story. But in actual fact, it was the story of why he left the Park Service and why he moved to Michigan and why he never talked about it. Mike said it all happened back in 1990, his last year as a ranger. He was stationed down in Carlsbad National Park, a place that's all red rocks, caverns, and trails through sand. And the way he described it, Carlsbad was empty most of the time, and it was just him and a few other rangers patrolling miles upon miles of sandy nothingness. The days were hot and the nights were cold, and the work was mostly routine stuff. He'd check trails and make sure hikers didn't get lost, all while keeping an eye out for poachers or vandals. He said he liked it at first, how he didn't mind being alone and how the desert gave him plenty of time alone with his thoughts. One day, late in the afternoon, he was out on a trail near the caverns. He was walking along on a day like any other, when he suddenly saw a guy come over a ridge. The man was limping, moving slow like he was hurt. Mike's first thought was that the guy needed help, that maybe he'd twisted an ankle or gotten bit by a rattlesnake or something. So he started jogging toward him, calling out to see if he was okay. But then, when he got closer, something felt off. The guy was obviously injured in some way, but Mike said the way he was looking at him made him nervous. He wasn't looking at him in a, oh thank God I've found help kind of way. It was this sort of cold stare. Mike said he once again asked the guy if he needed help, but in response, the guy pulled a pistol from the back of his pants and pointed it right at him. Of all the things Mike said he was expecting, having a gun thrust in his face was near the bottom of the list somewhere. He had his own sidearm, standard issue for rangers in case of wildlife or other trouble, but the guy had caught him off guard, and there was no time to draw. Mike said that, in a voice that sounded hard but desperate, the man told him to take off his uniform, and once he said that, Mike's mind started racing. The guy obviously wanted to disguise himself as a ranger, probably to get away from whoever was after him. The people chasing him could have been cops, but down there, I figured they could have been cartel or something as well. The guy kept the gun aimed at Mike's head and told him to take off his belt first, clearly wanting to make sure Mike was disarmed. But Mike wasn't stupid, and he knew how things would play out if he did. If he gave up his uniform, the guy wouldn't just let him walk away. A real ranger could blow the guy's cover and tell people he wasn't legitimate, so Mike figured the second that he stripped down and had his uniform taken away, he'd get a bullet in the head. The guy wasn't messing around. He said if Mike didn't take off the uniform, he'd shoot him and take it off his body. But Mike could tell that the guy didn't want to do that. Blood on the uniform would ruin the disguise and make it useless to him. Mike said he stood there, staring down the barrel of a gun with his heart pounding in his chest. He kept saying he couldn't, over and over, telling the guy he was too scared to move and that he'd have to take the uniform off himself. It was a gamble, but Mike was banking on the guy not wanting to shoot. The man started moving closer, his gun still pointed at Mike's head. Then, out of nowhere, they both heard a low rumble, like an engine coming from the hills behind the armed man. The man turned his back to look just for a split second, but that was all Mike needed. He moved fast, ducking low and lunging at the guy. The gun went off, but the bullet missed and kicked up dust a few feet away. Mike grabbed the guy's wrist, the one holding the gun, then after a brief struggle on their feet, they ended up going to the ground. They started wrestling, rolling in the dirt with the gun still in the guy's hand. Mike was bigger and stronger, and the guy was already hurt, but he fought like a cornered animal. Mike couldn't get the gun away. The guy's grip was too strong, and as he thrashed and bucked, he kept trying to point the barrel towards Mike's stomach and chest. Mike used his weight, pinning the guy down, but he couldn't get a good swing in to knock him out. His free hand was useless for punching, the angle was wrong and awkward, and the guy kept bucking underneath him. And so Mike did the only thing he could think of. He clamped his free hand over the guy's mouth and nose and started to suffocate him. The guy's eyes went wide and panicked as he realized that he couldn't breathe. He started thrashing harder, but Mike pressed and held on. He didn't want to kill the guy, just to make him pass out so he could get his gun away and cuff him, but the guy just wouldn't stop fighting. Mike kept his hand there, pressing hard, feeling the guy trying to suck air through his palm, and then suddenly, after almost a minute or so of doing this, he stopped. The guy's body went limp, but his eyes were still wide open and just staring up at the sky. Once he was still, Mike rolled off of him, panting, shaking from exertion, and the reality of what had just happened set in. He checked the guy's pulse. It was still there, but it was weak, and he then grabbed the guy's gun, made it safe, and then tucked it into his belt and used his radio to call for help. Not long after, another ranger showed up in a truck, which could have been the one they'd heard earlier, and they got the guy loaded up and back to the station. From there, an ambulance took him to a hospital a couple of hours away, and Mike thought that that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The guy didn't wake up. Doctors said that his brain had been starved of oxygen. He was in a coma, hooked up to machines, and his chances of coming back the same as he was before were slim. They tried to figure out who he was and put out all kinds of calls to various agencies, but nobody claimed him. He had no ID, no family, no records, nothing. And then after a few months, the hospital pulled the plug. And just like that, the guy was gone. Mike didn't go to prison or anything, and in fact, he was cleared of all wrongdoing. He said the investigation was open and shut, self-defense, pretty plain and simple. The guy had a gun, threatened to kill him, so Mike did what he had to do. But that didn't make things easier on him. He said all the cliches about taking a man's life were true, even if he knew in his heart that it was justified. He said he kept seeing the guy's face, the way his eyes looked when he realized he couldn't breathe. He hadn't meant to kill him, but he did, and so it ate at him. Mike said that he started having nightmares just a few weeks after. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of that gunshot in his head. He said he felt haunted, like the guy's ghost was following him around. And sometimes at night, he'd feel like someone was even watching him, standing just outside the window of his cabin. He knew that was just his mind playing tricks, but it felt real. Too real, and that's why he quit. He couldn't stay out there, not with those memories, and so he packed up and left New Mexico and traveled as far from the desert as he possibly could without ending up in Canada. He didn't tell anybody about the move, not even his family, just buried it deep down inside of himself and tried to move on. But he said you don't move on from something like that. Well, not really. You see, it stays with you, like some splinter under the skin that you can't get out. When Mike finished his story, I remember him stubbing out his cigarette before he took a long pull from his beer. He didn't look at me. He just sort of stared out into the darkness, but there was a calm about him, like he was glad that he'd gotten it off his chest. I didn't know what to say. I mean, what the hell do you say to something like that? So I just sort of sat there, letting the silence hang in the air until Mike finally changed the subject. After that night, Mike didn't bring it up again, and I didn't either. We went back to our usual route: fishing, beers, and sports. But after he told me his story, I saw him in a different light. He was still the same Mike, quick with a joke and always ready to lend a hand, but there was a kind of darkness about him, one that I hadn't really noticed before. I guess that's what happens when you take a life, even if you don't mean to. It changes you in a way that doesn't always show on the outside. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't eat corn the long way.
What?